Victor Haynes signed the foreclosure papers before the ink on Edmund Blackwell's death certificate had even dried. He didn't wait for the funeral, didn't send condolences. He sat behind his polished oak desk in the Land Commission office, poured himself a glass of expensive bourbon, and scratched his name across the bottom of the document with the satisfaction of a man collecting what he believed was already his. The Blackstone Ranch, 4,000 acres of the finest grazing land in the territory, sitting above silver deposits that Victor alone knew existed, would pass into his hands by sunrise. All he had to do was wait. Edmund's fool of a son would never find a wife in time. Nobody in Ash Hollow would help Rowan Blackwell tonight. Victor had made certain of that. He raised his glass toward the frosted window and smiled at the darkness outside. "Happy New Year, Rowan," he said to no one. "Enjoy your last night on that land. If this story already has you gripping your seat, you are exactly where you are supposed to be. Hit that subscribe button right now so you never miss what comes next. Because the stories on this channel do not slow down, they only get wilder. Smash the like button if you love frontier drama, and drop a comment telling me the city and country where you are watching from tonight. I read every single one, and I want to see just how far this story has traveled. Now stay with me, because what happens next inside that saloon will change everything. Whoa. The cold that settled over Ash Hollow on the last night of December was not the ordinary kind. It was the sort of cold that crept beneath doors and pressed itself against window panes, the kind that made horses stamp and pull against their posts, and made sensible people stay indoors with their boots still on, just in case. The temperature had been dropping since mid-afternoon, and by the time the sun finished going down, the main street of town had emptied out like a tipped bucket. Ash Hollow was not a large place. It had a post office, a feed store, a church with a bell that needed ringing, a doctor who also pulled teeth, and a saloon called the Copper Rail that did more business than all the other establishments combined. On a night like this, with the new year coming and the wind picking up off the ridge, every man in town who wasn't already home in bed was inside the Copper Rail, and a fair number of the women who had nowhere better to be were in there too. The saloon smelled like coal smoke and boiled potatoes and the particular sweetness of cheap whiskey that had been breathed out and breathed in again all evening. Red Dawson, who owned the place and poured his own drinks short, had strung a string of paper decorations along the back wall in honor of the occasion, and somebody had dragged in a fiddle player from one of the homesteads east of town, though by this hour the fiddler was mostly sleeping against his instrument in the corner. It was that kind of night. Comfortable. Settled. The kind of night where nothing was supposed to happen. The door blew open so hard it knocked a bottle off the nearest table. Rowan Blackwell stood in the frame with snow on his hat and his coat hanging open and his breath coming in short, visible bursts, like a man who had been riding hard and then running harder. He was 31 years old, not a particularly large man, but the kind that carried himself in a way that made people step back without quite knowing why. His face was his father's face, the same square jaw, the same eyes set deep under a heavy brow. But right now his father's face was doing something Edmund Blackwell's face had probably never done in its life. It was terrified. He pulled the door shut behind him and stood there for a moment, scanning the room, and the room scanned him back. The fiddler didn't wake up. Red Dawson set down the glass he'd been wiping. Gradually, the general noise of 20-odd people talking and drinking dropped to something quieter, not silence exactly, but the particular kind of hush that happens when people sense something is about to go wrong. "I need a wife," Rowan said. Somebody laughed. Just one person, at first, a man near the back named Cleet Osgood, who always laughed first and thought later. But then it spread. The way laughter does when people are warm and a little drunk, and somebody has just said something that strikes them as genuinely absurd. Within 5 seconds, half the room was laughing. Rowan didn't flinch. He walked to the center of the room, and something about the way he moved, not slow, not angry, just absolutely deliberate, pulled the laughter down a notch. "I mean it," he said. "I need a woman willing to marry me before midnight. Legal marriage signed and witnessed. I've got Reverend Miles waiting at the church right now." "Reverend Miles is half asleep and fully drunk," someone called from the far end of the bar, and there was more laughter, but it had changed texture. Less easy, more curious. Rowan reached into his coat and pulled out a folded paper. He opened it and held it up without shaking, which cost him something, because his hands wanted to shake. "My father's will," Edmund Blackwell. He paused long enough to let the name settle. Everybody in that room knew Edmund Blackwell's name, whether they'd liked the man or not. He wrote this himself, had it witnessed and filed with the Land Commissioner's office 6 months ago, which means Victor Haynes has had a copy sitting in his drawer since August. He paused again. The will says Blackstone Ranch transfers to me on the condition that I am married by my 31st birthday. That's tonight, midnight. The laughter was completely gone now. If I am not married by midnight, Rowan continued, his voice flat and controlled, the property reverts to the estate, which is then administered by the Land Commissioner. He folded the paper back up. Which means Victor Haynes gets 4,000 acres of the best grazing land in this territory, and every family running cattle on Blackstone Range loses their grazing contracts permanently. The silence after that was a different kind of silence, the kind with weight in it. Old Pete Halverson, who ran cattle on the eastern section of Blackstone Range and had been doing so for 11 years, set his glass down very carefully. Your daddy put that in writing? He did. And filed it with Haynes? With the commission office, yes, which Haynes runs. Rowan said it without expression. He'd had time to be furious about that part. He was done being furious. There wasn't time left for it. Lord Almighty, someone murmured from the back. That's a trap, said a woman's voice near the window. Clara Whitmore, the widow who ran the dress shop, speaking to nobody in particular. That's a trap and a half. How long ago did your daddy pass? Red Dawson asked from behind the bar. His voice had gone careful and even, the way voices go when a situation has shifted from entertainment to something that might require somebody to do something. 8 days ago, Rowan said. Victor had a rider at my door the following morning with a copy of the will and a reminder of the terms. 8 days, Red Dawson repeated slowly. I've been in 3 counties trying to sort this out legally. I've got a lawyer in Caldwell who says the will is valid. I've got another lawyer in Dodge who says maybe not, but maybe not doesn't help me tonight. Rowan looked around the room. So I need a wife. Tonight. Before midnight. He reached into his coat again and pulled out an envelope, which he set on the nearest table. $500 and the clear title to the south grazing parcel, 40 acres, good grass, running water, to any unmarried woman in this room willing to stand up with me in front of Reverend Miles tonight. The envelope sat on the table. Nobody moved toward it. $500 was not a small amount. The south parcel wasn't either. But marriage was marriage, and Rowan Blackwell was a man with a failing ranch and a desperate situation, and the women in the copper rail that night, the few who were there, were mostly looking at their hands, or at the wall, or at each other in the particular way of people who want very much not to be looked at. Cleet Osgood broke the silence. Which one of you girls wants to save the hero? He said it in the voice he used when he thought he was being funny, which was most of the time. Come on now, step right up. $500 to be Mrs. Desperate. He looked around with a wide grin, inviting the room to laugh again. A few people did. Nervous laughs. The kind that happen when people aren't sure if something is funny or awful. Rowan turned toward Cleet, and his expression was the kind that made Cleet stop laughing fairly quickly, but the damage was done. The women in the room had heard the tone in Osgood's voice, and that was that. No woman was going to stand up and walk across this room to take that envelope with Cleet Osgood's laughter ringing in her ears. Rowan knew it the moment he saw their faces close up, one by one, like shutters being pulled. He'd miscalculated. He'd thought $500 would be enough. He hadn't thought about what it would cost a woman to take it in front of an audience. He picked the envelope back up. He stood there for a moment that lasted longer than he wanted it to, feeling the particular kind of desperation that comes when you've run out of moves and you know it, and everybody in the room knows it too. Behind the bar, Red Dawson was looking at the clock on the wall. 11:47, 13 minutes. That was when the kitchen door opened. It didn't open dramatically, no bang, no sweep. It opened the way it always opened, smoothly on its well-oiled hinge, and a woman stepped through it carrying an empty tray she'd been bringing back from a table. She stopped when she registered the silence, looked around the room, and then looked at the envelope in Rowan's hand and the expression on his face. And her own face went through something quick and complex that most people in the room were too slow to catch. Martha Calloway was 33 years old. She'd been working the kitchen and sometimes the floor at the copper rail for 4 years, ever since her mother died and left her the small house on Creek Street with the leaking roof and the unpaid taxes. She was, by any standard measure, a big woman. Not tall, she stood 5'4" in her boots, but heavy in a way that had been the subject of comment and joke in Ash Hollow for as long as she'd been here, and probably before. She had dark eyes, very direct, that people tended to find uncomfortable in the same way they found a question uncomfortable when they didn't know the answer. Her face, entirely separately from everything else, was something that strangers sometimes stopped to look at twice. Fine-boned and clear-skinned, with a mouth that would have looked right at home on a painting if the painting had been in a city somewhere instead of a frontier saloon. She knew what she looked like. She'd known since she was 12 years old, when her mother had sat her down and explained to her very plainly that the world would see two contradictory things when it looked at her, and only one of them would be respected, and it would not be her face. She set the tray down on the bar without hurrying. "What's happened?" she said, though from the look of her she had already guessed roughly half of it. Red Dawson told her in 3 sentences. She listened without interrupting. When he was done, she stood quietly for a moment, and in that quietness the room waited, though not many of them knew quite what they were waiting for. Then she walked toward Rowan Blackwell. She didn't hurry. She walked the way she always walked, upright, solid, unhurried, with none of the shrinking that some large women develop as a kind of apology for the space they take up. People moved out of her path, which they generally did, partly because she was wide, and partly because there was something in her bearing that made stepping aside feel like the sensible choice. Cleet Osgood said something under his breath as she passed. 2 words, low enough that only the people nearest him heard them clearly. The man beside him snorted. The man beside him looked away. Martha didn't look at Cleet. She stopped in front of Rowan and looked at him directly, the way those dark eyes of hers had a habit of doing, and he looked back at her with the expression of a man who has stopped having preferences and is simply hoping. "How much time?" she said. He checked the clock. 11 minutes. She nodded, just once. "And what exactly are you offering?" $500 and clear title to the south parcel, 40 acres, good water." He paused. "And I'd add the written guarantee that the marriage is a legal arrangement only. I'm not asking for anything beyond what the law requires." He said the last part carefully, and it cost him a little dignity to say it, which he paid without flinching. Martha looked at him for a moment that felt longer than the clock said it was. "That's not what I'd want," she said. The room went very still. Somewhere in the back, someone set the glass down too hard. Rowan blinked. "I beg your pardon?" $500 and 40 acres, Martha said, and her voice was perfectly level, the kind of level that comes from being accustomed to rooms that are listening when you'd rather they weren't. "That's what you're offering a stranger to carry your legal future for you." She tilted her head slightly. "I've run the numbers in my head. The south parcel's assessed at around 800, 500 in cash. What you're offering altogether is worth maybe $1,300. She paused. "Blackstone Ranch, 4,000 acres, Silver Creek running through the North Quarter, mineral rights intact. What's it worth?" The silence in the room had a different quality now. Nobody was laughing. Rowan's jaw tightened. "Miss Calloway, I'm not insulting you," she said, with a patience that was almost unbearably calm. "I'm doing arithmetic." She glanced at the clock on the wall. "You've got 10 minutes. I'd appreciate it if you answered my question." Someone in the back made a low noise, not quite a whistle, not quite a laugh. It died quickly. Rowan looked at her. The desperation in his face hadn't gone anywhere, but something behind it had shifted, the way a man's expression shifts when a situation he thought he understood reveals itself to be something different. "If the debt is cleared," he said slowly, "the land is worth somewhere between $40,000 and $60,000, depending on markets. And the mineral rights?" A pause. "Nobody's done a full survey." "No," Martha agreed. "They haven't." She looked at him steadily. "I have some thoughts about that. But first," she reached out and took the paper from his hands, the folded will, and opened it, and read it the way she read everything, fast and completely, her eyes moving across the page with a focused efficiency that made Rowan think obscurely of a hawk scanning a field. She refolded it and handed it back. "It doesn't specify that the marriage has to produce anything except itself," she said. "A legal marriage, signed and witnessed, is sufficient to satisfy the condition, yes. And you'd need that to hold up under challenge. Yes. Haynes will challenge it." "Yes," Rowan said. "He will. Whatever I do tonight, he'll challenge it. Martha nodded. She was quiet for a moment, and in that moment the clock was very loud. Someone near the door shifted their weight, and the floorboard creaked. Then here's what I want, she said. Not $500 and 40 acres. I want half ownership of Blackstone Ranch. 50%, registered at the Federal Land Office and protected under territorial law. In writing tonight, before we walk into that church. The explosion of sound that followed was immediate and chaotic. Cleet Osgood laughed so hard he nearly fell off his stool. 3 or 4 other people laughed with him, and several more started talking at once, and Red Dawson made a sharp sound behind the bar that didn't quiet anyone. One man, Hayes Garrett, who ran a small herd on the northwest corner of Blackstone Range, turned red in the face and pointed at Martha and said something about greed and something about nerve and something that rhymed with neither but was worse. Martha didn't move. She stood in front of Rowan Blackwell, waiting, as though the room around her was a weather condition she'd decided to simply endure rather than acknowledge. Rowan looked at her. The noise was happening around both of them, and for a moment it was as though the two of them were standing in a peculiar kind of quiet at the center of it. He looked at her face, the dark, direct eyes, the patience that was not softness, the stillness of someone who had calculated something carefully and was waiting to see if the other party had calculated it too. He thought about Victor Haynes sitting in his office with bourbon in his glass and a smile on his face. He thought about 4,000 acres of his grandfather's land. He thought about what it meant to ask someone to stake their name and their legal standing on a desperate situation and offer them 40 acres in return. Agreed, he said. The laughter stopped like a lamp going out. Someone, it might have been Red Dawson, said, "Lord have mercy," very quietly. Cleet Osgood said, "You're out of your mind," in a voice that had lost all its amusement. Rowan was still looking at Martha. "Agreed," he said again, and this time it wasn't for the room. "Half ownership, 50%, filed legally and protected. You'll need to sign alongside me tonight." Martha was quiet for exactly 1 more second. Then she said, "Give me 5 minutes to get my coat." She turned and walked back through the kitchen door, and the room watched her go in the baffled, suspended way of people who have just watched something happen that they don't quite have a category for yet. Hayes Garrett found his voice first. "Rowan, you cannot be serious." "I'm serious. She's a—" He stopped, tried again. "She's nobody. She works in a kitchen. She just read a legal document in 45 seconds and identified the relevant clause," Rowan said, and his voice had steadied, the way a man's voice steadies when he's made a decision and finished making it. "What did you do tonight, Hayes?" Garrett's mouth opened and closed. 8 minutes, Red Dawson said from behind the bar, looking at the clock. He said it to nobody in particular, and maybe to everyone. Rowan walked to the bar and stood there, not drinking, just standing. His coat was still hanging open. He hadn't thought to close it. The cold from outside had followed him in and hadn't entirely dissipated, and he stood in it, waiting. Cleet Osgood slid off his stool and came to stand beside him, dropping his voice to something that was meant to sound reasonable and landed somewhere near condescending. "Listen, I know you're in a fix, I understand that, but you just handed half a ranch to a woman who—" He faltered. "Who what?" Rowan said. Cleet looked at him. "You know what I mean." "I don't think I do," Rowan said, and looked directly at Cleet until Cleet looked away. The kitchen door opened again, and Martha came out in her coat, which was dark wool and fit her squarely across the shoulders, and she was carrying a small leather satchel that she'd packed efficiently because she didn't own many things. She stopped in the middle of the room and looked at Rowan. "Do you have a witness for the property agreement?" she said. "We'll need someone with legal standing to sign the document before we go to the church." "Red," Rowan said without looking away from her. Red Dawson sighed the sigh of a man who has served this town for 20 years and is accustomed to being present at its most complicated moments. "Yeah, all right," he said. "Get me a piece of paper." Rowan had the paper. He'd had papers prepared for multiple contingencies because he'd spent the past 8 days in the company of lawyers. Martha watched him spread it on the bar, and watched Red Dawson read it, and watched Rowan sign it, and then she took the pen and signed it herself, her signature clear and unhurried. Martha Elaine Calloway. She didn't look triumphant. She looked like a woman completing a task she'd thought through carefully. 6 minutes, Red Dawson said, handing back the pen. "You'd better move." They moved. The copper rail emptied out behind them the way saloons empty when something worth watching is going to happen somewhere else. People pulled on their coats and followed, not out of goodwill exactly, but out of the particular frontier instinct that made people want to witness things, because witnessed things were real and unwitnessed things were only rumor. The cold hit them like a wall when they came through the door. Martha pulled her coat tighter and kept pace with Rowan without comment, her breath coming in white clouds that the wind took immediately. The church was 3 blocks north. The snow on the street was packed hard and slippery, and she planted her boots carefully, and he shortened his stride without quite realizing he was doing it. "You don't have to pretend," she said, not looking at him. "I'm not pretending anything." "You shortened your step," she said. "You don't have to. I walk fast when I need to." He didn't answer that. He let his stride go back to its natural length, and she matched it, and they walked the 3 blocks in a silence that wasn't quite comfortable but wasn't hostile either. It was the silence of 2 people who have just made a significant agreement and are both thinking about what it means. Behind them, at a distance of half a block, 20-some-odd people from the copper rail followed in a loose, chattering mass, their voices carrying forward on the cold air. Cleet Osgood was in there somewhere, saying something. Martha didn't listen for what. Reverend Miles was indeed half asleep when they knocked, and there was indeed the smell of bourbon about him. But he was also a man who took his legal obligations seriously, and when Rowan Blackwell told him what was needed and how much time there was left, the Reverend straightened up with the efficiency of a man who had been in difficult situations before and knew how to function in them. "You're both willing?" he said, looking first at Rowan and then at Martha with careful attention, the way a man looks when he needs to be certain. "Yes," said Rowan. "Yes," said Martha. "Any family present? Anyone who needs to—" "There's no time," Rowan said. The Reverend looked at the clock above his desk. "No," he agreed quietly. "There isn't." The people from the saloon had crowded into the church doorway and were filling the back 2 rows of pews. Someone had lit an extra lamp. The Reverend moved through the words with the particular efficiency of a man who knows which parts are legally required and which are ornament. And the ceremony that resulted was spare and fast, and Martha thought probably as honest as most of the longer ones. She stood straight. Rowan stood straight. They said what needed to be said. When it was done, and the document was signed with the Reverend's witness, and the time marked at 11:58, Rowan turned to look at her in the lamplight, and his expression was complicated in ways she didn't try to read just yet. "Thank you," he said, and meant it without knowing how to make it sound like he meant it without sounding like he was apologizing, which he couldn't quite avoid. "Don't thank me yet," Martha said. "You haven't seen the account books." He blinked. "I beg your pardon?" "The ranch accounts," she said. "When did you last go through them properly?" He stopped. He'd been managing the ranch in the broad strokes since his father got sick 2 years ago, but the detailed accounting had been his father's domain. And then it had been nobody's domain, and then there hadn't been time. "Not recently," he admitted. Martha nodded, and in her expression there was something that wasn't quite satisfaction and wasn't quite worry, but sat somewhere in between them. "We should go to the ranch tonight," she said. From the back of the church, Cleet Osgood called out, "Congratulations, Rowan. She'll have you eating out of her hand by spring." He laughed, and 2 or 3 others laughed with him, but it was thinner now, that laughter, less comfortable than it had been. Rowan didn't turn around. He was looking at Martha, and Martha was looking at him, and she said very quietly, "Are you going to let him talk like that? Or is that something I should factor in as well?" Rowan turned then. He looked at Cleet for a long, even moment. Then he said, "Cleet, I'd appreciate it if you kept your thoughts to yourself tonight." Cleet opened his mouth. Something in Rowan's face closed it again. The crowd shuffled and murmured. Old Pete Halverson, who had been quiet through all of it, put on his hat and nodded at both of them with the slow dignity of a man who has lived long enough to see that situations are more complicated than they look, and that the person laughing is not always the person who turns out to be right. Outside again, the cold was absolute. Rowan had 2 horses at the post in front of the saloon, and he hesitated when he saw Martha looking at them, thinking about the practicalities. "I can ride," she said before he asked. He nodded. He helped her up without comment and mounted himself, and they turned west toward the Blackstone Road together, while the lights of Ash Hollow receded behind them, and the new year settled in over everything, cold and clear and full of things none of them knew yet. She hadn't told him what she suspected about the accounts. Not yet. She wasn't certain enough to say it aloud on a cold street with a crowd still listening. But she'd been keeping the books at the copper rail for 2 years, and she knew what numbers looked like when they'd been arranged rather than simply accumulated. She'd caught two things in that will that Rowan hadn't noticed when she read it. She hadn't mentioned either of them. Not tonight. Tonight she'd done what needed to be done. Tomorrow she'd find out if she'd been right. The road to Blackstone Ranch was 4 miles of frozen ruts and pine shadows, and they rode it mostly in silence, which suited both of them. Once, about halfway, a branch cracked somewhere off to the left in the darkness, and both horses startled, and Rowan's hand went automatically to his hip before he stopped it, and Martha's grip on the reins tightened and released. "Deer," she said. "Probably," he said. They rode on. The ranch house came into view around a long bend, and even in the dark, Martha could see that things were not right. One of the outbuildings had a sagging wall she could see silhouetted against the sky. The fence along the north pasture had gaps in it. The yard, what she could see of it, had the particular emptiness of a place where work had stopped some time ago and not restarted. She didn't say anything. She filed it. Inside, Rowan lit the lamps and built up the fire in the kitchen stove, moving through the house with the automatic efficiency of a man who knows where things are but hasn't been looking at them properly. The house itself was decent, solid construction, reasonably maintained inside even if the outside was struggling. Martha stood in the kitchen and looked at it with a surveyor's eye while the stove began to tick with heat. "The account books," she said. "Where does your father keep them?" "Study," he said. "Through there." He gestured. "I'll start there," she said. "It's almost 1 in the morning," he said, not arguing exactly, just noting. "I know what time it is," she said, and looked at him, and he saw in her face the thing he'd seen in the saloon. Not stubbornness, but something more settled than stubbornness. Certainty about what needed to be done and in what order. "Coffee?" he said. "Please," she said. She went into the study and pulled the first ledger off the shelf and sat down at Edmund Blackwell's desk in her coat, because the study was cold, and the lamp made a circle of yellow light around her, and outside the window the new year continued arriving in darkness and frozen silence, while Martha Calloway, who was half owner of Blackstone Ranch as of 11:58 the previous evening, began to read. She read fast. She always read fast. The numbers came to her the way words come to some people, in patterns, in rhythms, in places where the pattern broke and the rhythm changed and something that didn't belong was hiding in the math. By 3 in the morning, she had filled 2 pages of her own notes. By 4, she had filled 5. By 5, when the first gray light was beginning to show in the east window and Rowan had fallen asleep in the chair by the kitchen stove, she set her pen down and sat for a moment in the cold quiet of the study and breathed. Then she picked up her notes and walked to the kitchen door and said his name. He woke up the way soldiers wake, instantly, completely, his hand going for his side before he was even upright. "Easy," she said. He blinked at her, looked at the window, looked at her notes. "What time?" "Early," she said. "I need to tell you some things." She sat down across from him at the kitchen table and spread her notes between them. "And I need you to listen without talking until I'm done, because some of it is going to make you angry, and if you start being angry in the middle, I'm going to lose my place." He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "All right." She nodded. She looked at her first page of notes. She took one breath. "Victor Haynes has been stealing from your family for 11 years, she said. The fire crackled in the stove. Outside, a bird tested the first note of morning and then thought better of it. Rowan was very still. "There's more," she said, and told him the rest. The fire in the kitchen stove had burned down to coals by the time Martha finished talking, and the room had gotten cold without either of them noticing because they were both too focused on the papers spread across the table between them to pay attention to things like temperature. Rowan sat with his elbows on the table and his hands clasped in front of his face, which was an expression Martha had not seen on him before and would later recognize as the face he made when he was working very hard not to do something he would regret. He'd been still for the last several minutes of her explanation, since the part where she'd laid out the loan manipulation, and the stillness had a coiled quality to it that made her choose her words with a little more care than usual. She finished. She set down her pen. She waited. He was quiet for a long time. 11 years, he said finally. At minimum. The earliest entry I can trace with certainty is from about 11 years back. It's possible it started before that, but your father's earlier ledgers aren't in this study. They may be in storage or they may not exist anymore. What do you mean, manipulated the loans? Martha pulled the relevant page of notes toward him and turned it so he could read it. Your father borrowed against the ranch 3 times in the past decade. First in 68, then 71, then 73. Each time, the loan was processed through the Territorial Land Commission office, which is standard practice out here. Each time, the interest rate recorded in your father's ledger doesn't match what's recorded in the commission copies. She tapped the page. I found 3 commission receipts in the back of the bottom drawer. Your father kept them, which is lucky because they show the original terms. Someone altered the figures after the fact. Not drastically, just enough to extend the repayment window and add compounding that shouldn't have been there. Small enough that if you weren't looking for it, you'd think your father had simply misremembered the terms. Rowan stared at the page. Victor Haynes runs the commission office. Yes. So he altered his own records. Or had someone do it. But yes. She folded her hands on the table. The effect, over 11 years with compounding, is that Blackstone Ranch carries roughly 3 times the debt it should actually carry. Which is why, when I looked at the asset column against the liability column, the numbers don't make sense for a ranch this size with this land. Your father wasn't a bad manager, Rowan. He was being bled. Rowan pushed back from the table and stood up. He walked to the window and stood there with his back to her, looking out at the gray early morning, and she let him stand there. She understood that some information needed space around it before a person could hold it properly. He turned around. You said there was something else, something about mineral rights. She'd been hoping he'd been paying attention to the order she'd presented things, and he had. She nodded. Your father's will mentions the mineral rights twice, once in the general property description and once in a separate clause near the end. Most people reading it would skim that second mention because it looks like legal repetition. She found the relevant note. But the language is slightly different in the second instance. The general description grants mineral rights to the estate in the standard language. The second clause specifies that mineral rights to the Eastern Hills section, approximately 400 acres, are held in a separate category and, quote, subject to commission review upon transfer. She looked up at him. That phrase isn't standard language. I've seen 2 other wills in the past 3 years. Red Dawson asked me to help him read his brother's estate documents, and Clara Whitmore showed me her late husband's will. Well, neither of them had that phrase. Rowan was very still again. Subject to commission review, which means Victor Haynes, as land commissioner, would have grounds to review and potentially contest the transfer of mineral rights on the eastern section specifically, even if the marriage condition is satisfied and the main property transfers cleanly. She paused, which raises the question of why your father included that language. He didn't write it himself, Rowan said, and the flatness in his voice was a different kind of flat from before. He had a lawyer write the will, fellow named Compton, out of Pratt. Is Compton? I don't know. He said it shortly, not rudely, but with the clipped quality of a man answering a question before he's ready to think about it. He walked back to the table and stood over the papers. What's on the eastern section? The hills? Martha looked at him. This was the part she'd held back until last, partly because she wasn't certain, and partly because certain kinds of information changed a room when they entered it, and she'd wanted the other things settled before she brought this one in. Have you ever noticed your creek running different colors after a hard rain? She said. He frowned. The north branch sometimes runs a little dark, reddish. I always thought it was clay. It might be. Or it might be oxidized silver or leaching out of the hillside into the water table. She said it evenly, without drama, because the information carried its own drama and didn't need her help. The eastern hills have an exposed rock face on the south slope that I noticed when we rode in this morning. In the lamplight, I couldn't see it well, but the coloring is consistent with what I've read about silver-bearing formations. I worked for 6 months at my cousin's assay office in Abilene before I came here. I'm not a geologist, but I know what the rock looks like when it's worth looking at more carefully. She paused. And Victor Haynes had a surveyor on this property 14 months ago. I know because I saw the man in town. He was asking Red Dawson for directions to the Blackstone eastern fence line, and he had survey equipment on his mule. The silence that followed was the particular silence of someone recalculating everything they thought they knew about a situation. Haynes knows, Rowan said. I think so. Yes. He knows what's in those hills, and he built the whole thing. The will clause, the loan manipulation, the midnight deadline, all of it to get the mineral rights to the eastern section. I think the main property is secondary, Martha said. I think it's the hills he wants. The rest is leverage and cover. She gathered her notes into a neat stack, which means we need to move faster than he expects, because right now he still thinks he won the night. Rowan looked at her across the table in the early morning light, and his face did something complicated that she didn't entirely analyze, because there wasn't time, and because she had learned a long time ago not to spend energy reading faces that weren't offering anything useful. What do you need? He said. I need to see the eastern section in daylight. I need access to all of your father's files, not just the study, storage, attic, wherever he kept older records. And I need you to go to the federal land office in Caldwell, not the territorial commission, the federal office, and file our marriage certificate and the property agreement there directly. She held his gaze. Not through the commission. Victor cannot be in the chain of that filing. Caldwell is a day's ride. I know that, which means you'd be here alone. I know that too, she said, and her voice was patient in a way that was not entirely without edge. He looked at her for a moment longer, then he nodded. I'll leave by 8. I want to look at the eastern section with you first. Agreed. They went out together in the early cold, crossing the frozen yard toward the eastern fence line. The sky was lightening from the east in stages, first gray, then a pale, washed-out blue that promised cold rather than warmth. Their boots crunched on the snow. Martha had wrapped her scarf tighter and pulled her coat close, and she walked with purpose, not like someone sightseeing, but like someone with a destination. Rowan pointed out the south-facing slope of the eastern hills when they got close enough to see it, and Martha stopped and looked at it for a long time without speaking. The exposed rock face caught the early light and showed a dark reddish-brown in the upper section that graduated to something paler below, and there were places where the stone had a particular sheen that wasn't quite what limestone did and wasn't quite what granite did either. That, Martha said quietly, pointing at the upper section. Rowan looked. It always looked like that. I thought it was just the rock type. Maybe, she said, but you need to get an independent assayer out here before Haynes does. Not someone who uses the commission referral list. Someone from outside the territory if you can manage it. She turned away from the slope. This is worth fighting for, all of it, but especially this. They walked back to the house, and Rowan saddled his horse while Martha went through the storage shed attached to the back of the house, which turned out to contain 3 wooden crates of older records going back 18 years. She did not stop to read them thoroughly. That would take days. But she identified the ones from the years that mattered and stacked them in the study to work through after he left. He came to the kitchen door before he rode out, already mounted, and looked at her where she stood with her sleeves rolled up and her hair coming loose from its pins. If anyone comes to the property while I'm gone, he said. I'll manage, she said. Martha. He said her name with a particular weight that was neither commanding nor pleading but sat somewhere between concern and something else he hadn't sorted out yet. Victor's men are not— I know what they are, she said. I've lived in this town for 4 years. I've watched how he operates. She looked up at him. Go file the papers. Come back with the federal certification. That's what matters right now. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he turned the horse and rode out, and she watched him go until the pine trees on the west road took him from view. She went back inside and put more wood on the fire and made herself a proper breakfast because she hadn't eaten since the previous afternoon, and there was going to be a great deal of work today, and she was not going to do it hungry. She found flour and salt pork and dried beans in the pantry, which was sparse but not empty, and she cooked without thinking about it, the way she always cooked, efficiently and without ceremony, because food was fuel, and she understood that about herself without apology. While she ate, she began on the storage crates, pulling files and reading fast and stacking them in date order. By mid-morning, she had found 3 things that mattered. The first was a letter from Compton, the lawyer who'd written Edmund Blackwell's will, dated 8 months before Edmund's death. The letter was careful and professional and said nothing explicitly wrong, but between the lines of its careful language was the clear shape of a man who had been asked to include something in a document and had not entirely wanted to include it, but had done so anyway, and was writing to create a paper record that he had raised concerns. The second thing was a survey map of the eastern section, hand-drawn and rough, but annotated in a different hand from the map itself. Smaller, neater writing that identified the upper rock formation with a notation AG, confirm. AG was the chemical symbol for silver. Martha sat with that for a moment. Then she kept reading. The third thing was a bill of sale, incomplete, missing its second page, for what appeared to be an option agreement on the eastern section's subsurface rights, signed by Edmund Blackwell and dated 4 years ago. The amount was small, embarrassingly small for what it appeared to be selling, but the bill was unsigned on the other side, meaning the transaction had not been completed. Edmund had apparently refused to sign, or had never been presented with the completed document, or had been presented with it and walked away. The buyer named on the first page was not Victor Haynes. It was a land-holding company with a long name that meant nothing to Martha until she turned the page over and found, in Edmund's handwriting at the top of the blank back, VH, Front Co. VH, Front Company. Martha sat back in the chair and looked at the ceiling for exactly 5 seconds, then looked back at the document. She was still looking at it when she heard the sound of a horse in the yard. She didn't panic. She folded the documents she was working with and put them inside her coat, which was hanging on the chair back, and she was wearing it by the time she heard boots on the porch steps. She got to the kitchen window in time to see one man dismounting, but there was a second horse tied at the post beyond him, which meant at minimum 2. The knock on the door was the kind that was not quite a knock and not quite a demand, but wanted to be both. She opened the door. The man on the porch was broad-shouldered and wore a coat with the Territorial Commission seal on the left breast pocket, a badge of office that Victor Haynes had apparently decided gave his employees license to knock on people's doors before noon. He had the look of a man accustomed to being on the winning side of conversations, and he was visibly recalibrating that expectation as he looked at Martha, because she was not what he'd expected to find here. "Mrs. Blackwell?" he said, and the hesitation before the name was barely there but was there. "Yes," she said. "Frank Cutter. I'm an agent with the Territorial Land Commission." He held up a card, which Martha looked at without moving to take it. "I'm here to conduct a preliminary assessment of the property in connection with the Blackwell estate matter. Standard procedure." "No," Martha said. He blinked. "I beg your pardon?" "This property is not subject to commission assessment," she said. "The estate condition was satisfied last night. The marriage is legal, witnessed, and documented. My husband has ridden to file the certification at the Federal Land Office this morning." She watched his face go through several small adjustments. "This is private property. You don't have a federal warrant, so you don't have authority to conduct an assessment without the owner's consent, and I'm not consenting." Cutter looked at her for a moment. Then he tried a different approach, the way men try different approaches when the first one doesn't work. And his new approach was the patient, reasonable, explaining things slowly voice. "Ma'am, the Commission has an interest in the mineral rights survey on the eastern section, which is a separate matter from the residential property, and covered under the same deed," Martha said. "All mineral rights, including the eastern section, transferred with the property under the marriage agreement. The will clause regarding commission review is currently under legal examination." She had no idea if that last part was strictly true, but it was true enough. She was going to make it true the moment she got a letter out to a federal solicitor, and she said it with the kind of certainty that made people treat uncertain things as established facts. "You're welcome to correspond with us in writing. I'll have our lawyer respond." The second man was still on his horse, watching. Neither of them had moved toward the door, which was something, though she did not make the mistake of thinking it was permanent. Cutter put his card away with the deliberate movements of a man who is angry and doesn't want to show it. "The commissioner will want to speak with your husband directly." "My husband will be back from Caldwell tomorrow," she said, "with federal certification. He's happy to speak with the commissioner after that." She started to close the door, then stopped. "And Mr. Cutter, I'd recommend you inform the commissioner that I've had occasion to review some of the Blackwell estate financial records this morning. He may want to be aware of that." She let that sit in the air for exactly long enough. Then she closed the door. She stood in the kitchen and listened to the sound of their boots on the porch steps, and then their horses moving out of the yard, and she waited until she couldn't hear them anymore. Then she sat down at the table and wrote 4 letters in rapid succession. To the federal solicitor's office, to an assayer in Wichita whose name she knew from her time in Abilene, to Red Dawson asking him to hold certain documents she'd list in a separate note, and to a woman named Agnes Farrow in Caldwell, who was a notary and had been a friend of Martha's mother and who could be trusted. She wrote fast and clearly with the particular efficiency of someone who knows what they know and knows how to put it on paper so it stays. She sealed the letters, addressed them, and put them in her satchel. She was not going to wait for Victor Haynes to decide the pace of this. Late afternoon brought a different visitor. She heard the horse well before it reached the yard, single rider, coming from the town direction. And she went to the window and felt something unwind slightly in her chest when she recognized Hayes Garrett, though she was honest enough with herself to note that slightly was not entirely. She opened the door before he knocked. Garrett was in his late 40s, weathered and direct, with the kind of face that hadn't been comfortable since approximately 1865. He had not been kind to her last night. He'd been the one pointing and saying things about greed. She held the door and waited. He took off his hat. That cost him something, she could see. "I owe you an apology," he said, without preamble, which she respected even though she wasn't ready to say so. "For which part?" she said. He had the grace to look uncomfortable. "For what I said. At the saloon." He turned his hat in his hands. "I have 23 cows on the North Range under a grazing contract with Blackstone. Been there 6 years. If Haynes had gotten this property, you'd have lost your contract," she said. "Yes. And instead you have a better chance of keeping it than you did yesterday, because the ranch didn't transfer to a man who intended to cancel every independent grazing arrangement and consolidate." She looked at him. "So what you're actually saying is that you're grateful, and the apology is the tax on the gratitude." He stared at her. Then slowly, something that might have been respect moved across his face like a weather front. "You're something else," he said. Not unkindly. "I've been told," Martha said. "Have you eaten? I'm going to make supper." I hadn't, so he came in, and they ate salt pork and beans at the kitchen table, and she asked him questions about the ranch's history that he answered slowly and carefully, because he was a man who thought before he spoke when the situation called for it, and she was making it call for it. He knew things she needed to know, about the pasture conditions, about which of the ranch hands had left in the past year and which might come back, about the state of the fencing on the south boundary that she hadn't had time to assess. "The bunkhouse has been empty since October," he said. "Rowan sent the last 2 men off when the money got tight. He didn't want to, I know that, but there wasn't the cash." He pushed his bowl back and looked at her across the table. "You found something in those books, didn't you? That's what you told Cutter." "I found several things," she said. "Things that explain why it got tight when it shouldn't have." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "Edmund was not a foolish man," he said, and there was something almost grieving in his voice, careful and old. "He built this ranch over 30 years. It shouldn't have been in the state it was in." "It wasn't his fault," Martha said, and she meant it plainly, without softening it, because sometimes the plainest things were the kindest. Garrett nodded slowly. He picked up his hat from where he'd set it on the bench beside him and held it. "What do you need?" he said. "I've got 3 good men working for me. If you need eyes on the eastern pasture or someone to ride the fence line while Rowan's away. I'd appreciate someone keeping an eye on the east road," she said. "Cutter came this morning with a friend. They left when I asked them to, but I don't expect that to hold." Garrett put his hat on and stood. "I'll have a man at the east road by dark," he said. "No cost. It's the right thing." After he left, Martha stood at the window for a while and watched the last light go out of the sky. The eastern hills were a dark shape against the darker sky, and she thought about what was inside them, and about the document with VH front Coro written on the back in Edmund Blackwell's hand, and about what it had cost the old man to refuse to sign it. She thought about Rowan riding in the cold toward Caldwell, carrying papers that were the difference between everything and nothing. She thought about Victor Haynes, sitting in his office right now, doing his own calculating. Then she went back to the storage crates and kept reading, because there was still a great deal of night left and she intended to use it. She was on the 4th crate, past midnight with the lamp turned up, when she found the assay report. It was from 8 years ago, professional letterhead from a company out of Denver. 14 pages of dense technical language that Martha read once quickly and then again slowly, her finger moving along the lines. By the time she'd read it through a second time, the lamp had burned lower and her hand was very still on the page. The eastern section of Blackstone Ranch did not contain a silver deposit. It contained three. The report estimated combined yield potential, conservatively, in the low hundreds of thousands of dollars. It recommended immediate formal claim filing. At the bottom, in Edmund Blackwell's handwriting, was a single note. Not yet. Not until R is settled. R. Rowan. Edmund had known. He'd known for 8 years, and he'd sat on it, waiting for the right moment. And in the meantime, Victor Haynes had found out, and manipulated the loans, and written himself into the will's language, and constructed a trap to take everything, while Rowan was too young and too busy keeping the ranch running to see what was happening beneath the ground he was standing on. Martha sat with that for a long time. Then she added the assay report to the documents inside her coat and went to put more wood on the kitchen fire because it was very cold, and she was going to be awake for a while longer, and being cold didn't help anyone think. Somewhere out on the East Road, one of Hayes Garrett's men was riding a slow circuit in the dark, watching for company. Martha was grateful for that. She was also honest enough to know that gratitude didn't make the situation safe, only slightly less exposed. Tomorrow, Rowan would come back from Caldwell with the federal certification, or he wouldn't, and things would go one way or the other from there. She had done what she could do tonight. She had the documents. She had the assay report. She had the letter to the federal solicitor sealed and addressed and ready to go out with the Morning Post writer. She had not, she noticed distantly, spent a single moment of the past 12 hours thinking about the way the saloon had laughed at her last night. Not because it hadn't stung, it had, in the particular way things sting when they are not new, but because there was simply too much else to do, and she had learned a long time ago that the weight of other people's opinions was a thing you could carry or a thing you could set down, and she had chosen, at some point she couldn't precisely identify, to set it down. She refilled her coffee cup and went back to the last crate. There was still work to do. Rowan came back from Caldwell in the late afternoon of the following day, riding hard enough that his horse was lathered despite the cold, and Martha knew from the set of his shoulders when he came through the yard gate that something had gone wrong before he'd even dismounted. She met him at the door. He came in without speaking, stripped off his gloves, and dropped a leather folder on the kitchen table. His face was the face of a man who has been moving fast for 24 hours on very little sleep and has arrived somewhere he didn't expect to arrive. Filed, he said. Federal certification is registered. Marriage, property agreement, the full document package. He paused. But Haynes got there before me. Martha looked at the folder but didn't open it yet. How? He had a rider leave before dawn yesterday. Must have gone through the night. Rowan pulled out the chair and sat down heavily. By the time I got to the federal office, there was already a commission petition on file contesting the validity of the marriage on grounds of undue duress, claiming I coerced a vulnerable woman into a fraudulent agreement under time pressure. Martha was quiet for a moment. He's claiming you coerced me. Yes. She sat down across from him. That's actually less clever than I expected. Rowan looked up. How is that less clever? It puts the burden on him to prove I'm vulnerable, she said, which anyone who spent 10 minutes with me will find difficult to argue with a straight face. She pulled the folder toward her and opened it. What did the federal clerk say? That the petition would need to be reviewed by a federal magistrate, which takes time, and that in the interim, the property status is considered disputed. He watched her read, which means Haynes can continue to act as if the transfer is incomplete. How much time does a review take? Weeks, maybe longer. Martha set down the papers. She looked at the window where the last of the afternoon light was going flat and gray. Then she looked back at Rowan. Did you speak with a federal solicitor while you were there? I tried. The one the clerk recommended was out of town until next week. Agnes Farrow, the notary I wrote to. She'll know someone. I sent her a letter yesterday. She turned back to the folder. Sit there. I need to show you what I found last night, and I need you to be calm when I show you, because some of it is going to be harder than what I told you this morning. He looked at her with an expression that was partly exhaustion and partly the particular wariness of a man who has already received several pieces of bad news and is not certain he has room for more. How much harder? Your father knew about the silver for 8 years, she said. She told him about the assay report. She told him about the notation at the bottom. Not yet. Not until R is settled. And she watched his face go through something private and complicated that she did not try to interpret, because it was the kind of thing a person needed to work through on their own terms. His jaw worked. His eyes went somewhere that wasn't the kitchen table and wasn't the window. He was protecting it for me, Rowan said, and his voice had gone rough at the edges in a way that had nothing to do with the cold ride. Yes, Martha said, simply. And Haynes found out. I believe Haynes had the same area surveyed independently, probably around the time your father refused to sign the option agreement for the subsurface rights. She put the document in front of him, the incomplete bill of sale with VH front comas in Edmund's handwriting on the back. After that, I think Haynes decided that waiting for a willing seller wasn't going to work, so he moved to manufacturing a situation where he could take the property legally. Rowan stared at his father's handwriting. His hand went flat on the table, pressing down, and Martha noticed that his knuckles were white. I want to ride to Haynes's office right now, he said quietly. I know. I want to put the man through his own window. I know that too, she said, without judgment. And I need you to not do that, because it would undo every legal advantage we currently have and give him exactly the kind of situation he can control. She waited until he looked up at her. We are going to beat Victor Haynes, but we're going to do it in a way that he can't recover from, and that requires doing it correctly. He held her gaze. Some of the white went out of his knuckles. What do you need me to do? He said. Eat something, she said. Then sleep. We'll start early tomorrow. He almost argued. She could see it, the impulse to keep moving, to keep reacting, which was the impulse of a man built for physical action being asked to sit still in a situation that felt physical. But exhaustion overruled impulse, and he ate what she put in front of him without tasting it, and went to sleep in the chair by the fire while she sat at the table and kept reading. The plan formed over the next 3 days, not all at once but in pieces, the way good plans do. Each new piece of information suggesting the next move, each move opening a sightline onto something further ahead. Martha was not a strategist by training. She was a woman who had spent her adult life paying close attention to systems, financial systems, social systems, the systems of how power moved through a small town. Because paying close attention was what you did when you couldn't afford to miss things. And she had not, as a rule, missed things. The shape of what she was building was this. She needed to make Victor Haynes believe that the situation had resolved in his favor, at least temporarily, in order to get him to move prematurely. A man who believed he was winning would act. A man who thought he still had time would wait. And waiting, in this case, was the one thing Victor could not be allowed to do. To create the appearance of a resolution in his favor, she needed Rowan to appear to leave. She explained this to Rowan on the morning of the second day, over coffee that was too strong because she'd been awake since 3. He listened with his elbows on the table and a particular tension around his eyes that she'd started to recognize as his thinking expression. When she finished, he sat quietly for a moment. You want me to ride out publicly, he said. Make it look like I've given up. Not given up. Make it look like you've gone to consult lawyers in another city and left the property effectively undefended. She turned her coffee cup in her hands. Haynes has people watching this road. Cutter came here once, and I don't think it was the only time someone has been by. If you ride out toward Caldwell with a packed saddlebag, that information will reach him within hours. And then he moves on the property. He'll try. He'll come here, or he'll send Cutter, and I need him to come in person. She looked at Rowan steadily. Because if he comes here and acts to seize the property without a legal warrant, if he does that in front of witnesses, then he's committed an act that goes beyond fraudulent paperwork and into something the federal marshals have clear authority over. Rowan looked at her. You'd be here alone when he comes. I'd be here with whoever Hayes Garrett can spare, she said, and with the evidence I've been building for the past 3 days, and with a letter that goes to the federal marshal's office in Wichita the moment you ride out, informing them of what we suspect and asking them to be available to respond. She paused. I'm not asking you to abandon me, Rowan. I'm asking you to ride to the federal marshal's office directly, not to Caldwell, so that you can bring back the authority to act on everything I've documented. He was quiet for a long time after that. Outside, one of Garrett's men was visible at the tree line on the east pasture, a small figure on horseback moving slowly. What if he doesn't come himself? Rowan said. What if he sends Cutter and stays clean? Then we use what I have to compel an audit of the commission records, and it takes longer and costs more and is less satisfying but still works, she said. But I don't think he'll stay clean. I think he's been waiting for this for years and he won't delegate it. She looked at him. I think you know that too. He did. She could see it in the set of his jaw. If anything happens to you, he started. Then you'll deal with it when you get back, she said, not harshly. But I need you to go, Rowan. This only works if he thinks the situation has opened up. The third thing she needed was a witness who was not on Haynes's payroll and not already in their camp. Hayes Garrett was solid, but he had an obvious stake in the outcome, and a good lawyer would argue it. She needed someone that Victor Haynes would not have thought to compromise. She found her answer in an unexpected place. Clara Whitmore, who ran the dress shop and had said that's a trap and a half in the saloon on New Year's Eve, came to the ranch on the afternoon of the second day uninvited, riding a rented horse with somewhat more determination than elegance. She knocked on the door, and when Martha opened it, she said, I've heard things, and I want to know if they're true. Martha looked at her for a moment. Then she stepped back and held the door open. Come in. Clara Whitmore was 52 years old and had been widowed at 44, and in the 8 years between those two events and the present day, she had built a business, survived 3 bad winters, sent 2 daughters east for schooling, and developed an opinion of Victor Haynes that she had not previously found occasion to act upon. Her husband, she told Martha over coffee, had borrowed from the Land Commission once, 9 years ago. A small loan, paid back in full. But the repayment hadn't been properly recorded for almost 2 years. And in those 2 years, his credit in the territory had been compromised in ways that cost them 2 contracts they should have won. I never could prove it was deliberate, Clara said. She held her cup in both hands, looking at it. Emmett said I was seeing shadows. Maybe I was. She looked up. Are you telling me I wasn't? I'm telling you the pattern is consistent with what I found in the Blackwell accounts, Martha said. Whether your husband's situation was part of the same pattern, I can't say for certain, but it fits. Clara nodded. She set her cup down. What do you need from me? Martha told her. On the morning of the third day, Rowan packed a saddlebag visibly, went to the barn, came back out with it, went back to the barn, the kind of back and forth that a person watching from the tree line would read as preparation for a longer journey. He said goodbye to Martha in the yard, not quietly, but not loudly either, in the way a man says goodbye when he's not sure how long he'll be gone. His hand went to her arm for a moment, a brief grip just above the elbow that she didn't pull away from. Don't let him bluster you, he said. He won't, she said. And if his men? Rowan. She looked at him. I have been managing difficult men in tight spaces for my entire adult life. I worked a saloon kitchen. I know how to handle myself. He looked at her, and something in his face went a little sideways in a way she had started to notice and had not decided what to do about yet. Then he mounted and rode west, not toward Wichita directly, because he'd take the south road and cut across to avoid being followed too easily, but the watching man on the tree line would see him go, and that was the thing that mattered. Martha went inside and sent Clara Whitmore, who had spent the night in the spare room, to fetch Red Dawson. She had one more piece to set before Victor came. Red arrived by mid-morning on his own horse, looking like a man who had been given incomplete information and was reserving judgment. He came in, sat down, accepted coffee, and listened while Martha explained what she needed him to do, which was to be present on the property, and specifically to be visible, to sit on the porch if the weather allowed, to be somewhere that a man riding in from the east road would see him and register him as a witness before any other considerations occurred to him. You think Haynes is coming today? Red said. I think he'll hear that Rowan left this morning, and I think he'll come before the day is out, Martha said. I think he'll come because he's been waiting for exactly this, and because he's not a patient man beneath the careful surface, and because the longer he waits, the more time we have to build our case, and he knows it, even if he doesn't know how much we already have. Red turned his cup. You've thought this through. I've had 3 days, she said. He looked at her across the table with the slow, measuring attention of a man who has watched people for 20 years and has gotten reasonably good at it. I owe you an apology too, he said. New Year's Eve. I should have said something to Osgood. You kept the clock, she said. That was more useful. He almost smiled. I'll be on the porch, he said. He went out, and Martha sat alone in the kitchen for a few minutes in the quiet. Outside, she could hear Clara moving around in the yard, and the sound of Garrett's man walking his horse at the tree line. The house around her was still the house of a dead man. Edmund Blackwell's books on the study shelf, Edmund Blackwell's coat hanging on the hook by the door, Edmund's handwriting on documents she'd spent 3 days reading. It wasn't her house yet in the way that mattered, which was the feeling. But it was her house legally, and she was going to defend it. She went to the bedroom she hadn't slept in yet. She'd taken the chair in the study every night, and retrieved from beneath the mattress where she'd put it for safekeeping the small pistol she owned and had brought from Ash Hollow in her satchel. It was a short-barreled revolver, not elegant, not new, a practical tool she'd purchased 2 years ago after an incident in the saloon that she did not intend to repeat. She checked that it was loaded, which it was, and put it in her coat pocket, which was deep enough, and went back to the kitchen. She had one more letter to write, to send with Garrett's man to the telegraph office in town, addressed to the federal marshal. She wrote it in 10 minutes, sealed it, and had it sent before noon. Then she sat at the table with the full document package in front of her and waited. Victor Haynes arrived at 4 in the afternoon. She heard them before she saw them. Not one horse, multiple. The particular drumming of a group moving with purpose rather than wandering. Red Dawson, on the porch, stood up from the chair he'd been occupying and crossed his arms, which was not a threatening posture exactly, but was the posture of a man choosing to stand his ground. Martha went to the window first, counted 5 riders, and felt something tighten in her stomach that she breathed through and then set aside. 5 was more than she'd hoped for, but not more than she'd considered. She kept her hand in her coat pocket and went to the door and opened it before anyone knocked. Victor Haynes was a tall man, taller than she'd expected from the way people talked about him, as though powerful men were always assumed to be large, and she'd somehow translated that into his physical size. He was probably 60, silver-haired, with a face that had the particular arrangement of features that suggested it had once been handsome and now settled for authoritative. He wore a good coat and good boots, and the expression of a man visiting a property he already considered his own. His eyes went to her, and she watched them do what eyes always did when they looked at her. The quick, involuntary assessment, the categorization, the small recalibration that happened when people filed her under large woman working in a kitchen and then had to update their file when she looked back at them with those direct dark eyes and didn't move out of the doorway. He recovered quickly. She gave him that. "Mrs. Blackwell," he said, and the courtesy was the expensive kind, the kind that cost nothing because it didn't mean anything. "I'm Victor Haynes. I believe you know who I am." "I do," she said. "I know a great deal about you, Mr. Haynes, more than you'd probably prefer." Something shifted in his expression, very slightly. "I understand your husband has left the property." "He's traveling on business," she said. "Is there something you need?" "I've come to discuss the property status," he said. "In light of the outstanding commission petition." "There is no outstanding commission petition," Martha said. "The federal certification has been filed. The commission petition was based on a claim of coercion that has no factual basis, as I'm happy to demonstrate in front of a magistrate, and which I expect will be dismissed when reviewed." She held his gaze. "If you've come to discuss the property, I'm afraid there's nothing to discuss. This is Blackwell property. My property, co-equally, under registered deed." Haynes looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at Red Dawson, standing on the porch with his arms crossed, and at the periphery of the yard where Clara Whitmore had appeared from the side of the house and was standing with her hands in her pockets, watching. He looked back at Martha. "You've assembled some neighbors," he said, and his tone had changed. Less courtesy, more something else beneath it. "I have guests," she said. "Is there something specific you need, Mr. Haynes, or did you ride out here with 4 men for the pleasure of the view?" One of his riders, a young one, positioned slightly behind and to the right, made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite anything else. Haynes didn't look at him. "I have a commission order," he said, and reached into his coat, "authorizing a formal assessment of the Eastern Section mineral rights pending resolution of the estate petition." He held out the paper. Martha took it. She read it the way she read everything, completely and fast. She was aware while reading of the 4 men on horseback behind Haynes, and of the weight in her coat pocket, and of Red Dawson behind her and to the left. She finished reading and looked up. "This is a commission order," she said, "not a federal warrant. As I explained to Mr. Cutter 3 days ago, this property is not subject to commission authority for assessment without a federal warrant, because the mineral rights are included in the federal deed registration." She handed the paper back to him. "You're welcome to pursue a federal warrant through the magistrate. I'd be interested to see how that goes." Haynes didn't take the paper immediately. His hand stayed where it was, holding it between them, and his eyes were doing something that she identified as the look of a man deciding whether to drop a pretense. He dropped it. "Let me be direct with you," he said, and his voice had changed, lost the courtesy, lost the professional smoothness, gone somewhere harder and quieter. "You are a woman who worked in a saloon kitchen. You married a desperate man under conditions that any reasonable review will find problematic. You've had the run of this house for 3 days because Rowan Blackwell left you here, which tells me everything about how much he trusts this arrangement himself." He looked at her steadily. "This property has been in my planning for 4 years. I am prepared to offer you a settlement, a generous one, and I would very strongly recommend you take it, because the alternative is a legal process that will be long, expensive, and ultimately unsuccessful." The yard was very quiet. Red Dawson had uncrossed his arms. Clara Whitmore had taken a step forward. The rider behind Haynes had stopped making any sound at all. Martha looked at Victor Haynes. She thought about Edmund Blackwell's handwriting at the bottom of the assay report. Not yet. Not until R is settled. She thought about 11 years of loan manipulation. She thought about the Compton letter, carefully written by a lawyer trying to create a paper record of his own discomfort. She thought about VH Front Co. in Edmund's hand on the back of an unsigned bill of sale. She thought about Cleet Osgood's 2 words as she'd walked past him in the saloon, low enough that only the people nearest him heard. "I have 3 things to say to you," she said, and her voice was very even, the way it went when she was extremely focused. "First, the independent assay report on the Eastern section, commissioned 8 years ago by Edmund Blackwell, which I found in this house 3 days ago, estimates combined yield potential at several $100,000. You have known about this for at least 4 years, and you built a fraudulent legal structure to acquire it. I have the assay report. I have the original loan documents showing interest rate discrepancies. I have a letter from your front company's incomplete option agreement with Edmund's notations on the back. And I have a letter already received at the Federal Marshal's office in Wichita detailing all of the above." She paused. "Second, I am not a woman who worked in a saloon kitchen. I am half owner of Blackstone Ranch, registered at the federal level, with co-equal legal standing, and I have more documentation of your fraud in this house than you have managed to destroy in 4 years of trying." She looked at him without blinking. "Third, you should leave this property now, while leaving is still your choice." The silence after that was the kind of silence that has substance, that occupies space. Haynes looked at her for a long moment. Something moved through his face. It started as contempt and moved through calculation and arrived somewhere she couldn't quite name, a place between fury and something that might have been, in a different man, closer to fear. "You think a woman's word against the territorial commissioner," he started, "is considerably stronger when accompanied by a federal assay report, 3 sets of manipulated loan documents, evidence of a front company, testimony from at least 2 affected parties in addition to the Blackwell estate, and a sitting federal marshal who received my letter at approximately 2 this afternoon," Martha said. "Yes, I do think that." Haynes's hand tightened on the paper he was still holding. Behind him, the young rider had gone very still. It was at that moment that Haynes made the decision that Martha had been hoping he would not make but had prepared for anyway. He turned to the rider on his left, not Cutter, someone else, a broader man with a flat expression, and said, in a voice that was trying to be quiet and was not quite quiet enough, "Go around to the study window." Martha's hand was already in her coat pocket. "That man doesn't move from his horse," she said, loud enough for everyone in the yard to hear. "Or I will put a bullet through the study window myself before he gets there, and everything inside becomes evidence for federal investigators of an attempted forcible entry." She looked at the broad man, who had gone still with one boot half out of the stirrup. "And you will be named specifically in the federal complaint." The man looked at Haynes. Haynes looked at Martha. Red Dawson said, from the porch, in the quiet voice of a man who has been watching a long time and is done watching, "Victor, you ought to go." Nobody moved for 3 full seconds. Then Haynes put the paper back in his coat, and his face went somewhere private and compressed, and he turned his horse without another word. His riders turned with him, the broad one last, and they rode out of the yard in the direction they'd come from, and Martha stood in the doorway and watched them until the east road took them out of sight. Her hand, inside her coat pocket, was not entirely steady. She didn't let go of the pistol until she was certain they were gone. Red Dawson came down off the porch and stood beside her. He was quiet for a moment. "That front company note," he said. "That's your strongest piece." "Yes," she said. "You think he knows you have it?" "He knows now," she said. "I wanted him to know. A man who knows his evidence has been found makes mistakes that a man who thinks he's clean doesn't." She let go of the pistol and took her hand out of her pocket and flexed her fingers. "He'll try something tonight, or he'll try to get to the documents through legal means before the federal marshal can act." She turned toward Clara. "You need to go to town and send a telegraph to Rowan in Wichita. Tell him Haynes came in person and left, and that he needs to bring the marshal as fast as he can arrange it." Clara nodded, already moving toward her horse. "Red?" Martha said. "I'll stay," he said, before she could ask. She nodded. She looked out at the east road, empty now in the failing light, and felt the cold coming off the hills and thought about the 3 silver deposits sitting in the eastern section, patient and indifferent to all of it, as they had been for 1,000 years before any of them had names. Haynes wasn't done. She knew that as certainly as she knew the value of what he was trying to take. She went inside to check the study window latches, and to make sure the lamps were lit, and to wait for whatever he was going to try next. She didn't have to wait long. It was past 10 when she smelled it. Not smoke first, but heat. Something wrong with the quality of the air near the back of the house. And she was already moving toward the kitchen when the orange light began to show through the window above the stove. "Fire," she said, loudly and without panic, because panic was the enemy of movement. "Red, fire. Back wall." She heard him coming from the front room as she grabbed the door and pushed through it into the cold night and saw what they had done. The woodpile against the back wall of the house, stacked there all winter, was burning, and the dry wood had caught the exterior wallboards, and the boards had caught fast because the night was cold and dry, and everything was tinder in January. 2 men on horseback were at the fence line on the back pasture, close enough that she could see them against the firelight, far enough that they were calculating safety. Red came out behind her and stopped. "I'll get the well bucket," he said, already turning. "It's too far gone on that wall," she said. "Get my satchel from the study and the document case on the desk. That's what matters." "Martha, go," she said. "I'll manage the men." She went toward the fence, not running, not because she wasn't afraid, but because running was what prey did and she was not going to be prey. And as she moved toward them, one of the 2 riders stirred and she heard him say something to the other one, something she caught only the end of. "Can't get out that way. She's too—" She recognized the laugh that followed. She had filed it away 3 days ago when she'd been standing at the front door watching Cutter leave. The wall was burning. She could feel it on her back and her left side, the radiating heat of a fire that had taken hold and was going to do what fire did. She thought about the documents inside, and about Red already moving through the study, and about the distance between herself and the burning wall, and about the structure of the house, which she had been learning for 3 days and knew well enough now. The kitchen wall, where the fire was burning, was the thin wall. The exterior boards were old and dry. The interior kitchen wall, by contrast, was brick-backed. She'd noticed it when she was checking the stove installation, old frontier-style fireproofing from when the house was built. If the fire stayed on the kitchen exterior, the brick backing would slow it significantly. She turned and went back to the house, not toward the kitchen but around the side, and came in through the front door and went down the hall to the study. Red was there with her satchel over his shoulder and the document case under his arm, and his expression when he saw her come in through the interior hallway instead of the back was the expression of a man who had been expecting to have fewer options than he apparently had. "Interior wall is brick," she said, slightly out of breath. "The kitchen may be lost, but the study and front rooms have time." She took the document case from him. "Is there anything else in here that can't be replaced?" He looked around the study. That surveying map on the wall, and the deed box in the bottom drawer. Rowan's grandfather's original land grant. She got the deed box. He got the map. They moved back through the front of the house in a fast, practical circuit, taking the things that mattered, and came out the front door and into the cold air and the orange light of a burning wall, and Martha did not stop moving until she was at the fence on the far side of the front yard, where the documents would be far enough from the heat to be safe. Then she turned and looked at her house burning, and she felt the particular quality of rage that comes from being underestimated and acted upon by someone who thought large meant slow, and working in a kitchen meant nothing worth taking seriously. She looked at the two men still at the back fence. She memorized their faces in the firelight with the thoroughness of someone who has learned that memory is documentation, and that documentation is the thing that matters in the end. "I see you," she said, not loudly, not hysterically, but with the clarity of a simple fact. "Both of you. I see your faces." They were already pulling their horses back from the light. She let them go. She had what she needed. Red came to stand beside her. His coat smelled like smoke and his face was lit orange from the fire, and he looked at the burning wall with the expression of a man who has watched enough bad things happen to know that some of them cannot be stopped, only survived. "You all right?" he said. "Yes," she said, which was not entirely true and was true enough. She put her hand on the document case and kept her eyes on the fire, and she did not let herself think about anything beyond what came next, because what came next was what mattered, and she had never in her life been a woman who could afford to stop at the thing that hurt. The kitchen wall burned through the night. Martha and Red Dawson stood in the frozen yard and watched it go in the methodical, helpless way you watch something that cannot be stopped, only contained. The brick backing did what she'd hoped. It held the fire from spreading into the study and front rooms. But the kitchen itself was gone by midnight, and part of the back hall with it, and the roof above that section sagged and then dropped inward with a sound like a slow exhalation somewhere around 2 in the morning. Red had found a bucket line that accomplished nothing useful except giving him something to do, and she had let him do it because standing still while something burns is its own particular torture, and she understood that. She stood with the document case against her chest and the satchel over her shoulder and watched the fire with the attention of someone filing information rather than grieving, because grieving was for later and information was for now. The two riders at the back fence had been gone since shortly after she'd told them she could see their faces. She had memorized what she needed. She replayed it periodically as she stood there. One was shorter, riding a gray horse with a distinctive white blaze, wearing a coat with a torn left lapel that caught the firelight. The other was older, heavy-set, sitting his horse like a man more accustomed to driving a wagon than riding. She would know them both again. That was sufficient. By 3 in the morning, the fire had burned down to smoldering ruin at the back of the house, and the cold was doing the work that the bucket line hadn't, and Martha finally went inside through the front door and sat in Edmund Blackwell's study chair and put the document case on the desk in front of her and did not sleep. She was still sitting there when the gray light came through the east window, and Red Dawson appeared in the doorway with 2 cups of coffee that he'd managed to make somehow using the small iron stove in the front parlor, which was the only heat source left functional in the house. He handed her one without speaking. She took it. They sat for a few minutes in the particular silence of people who have been through something together and don't need to discuss it immediately. "He'll know the documents weren't in the kitchen," Red said finally. "Yes," she said, "which means he'll know burning it didn't work." "Yes." Red turned his cup in his hands. He looked at the document case. "How long before Rowan gets back, do you think?" If Clara's telegraph reached him last night, and if the marshal was available and willing to move quickly, she calculated, late today, possibly tonight. That's a long time. "I know." Red looked out the window. The east pasture was empty. Garrett's man had ridden out sometime in the small hours, which Martha had noted without comment. Garrett's men had their own operations to run. She hadn't expected more than she'd received, and what she'd received had been considerable. "I need you to do something for me this morning," she said. "Name it." "Go to town. Go to the Copper Rail and open for business as normal. I want you to be visible, and I want you to listen to what people are saying about last night, and I want you to send word immediately if Haynes makes any public move, any filing, any announcement, anything that looks like he's trying to create a legal fait accompli before Rowan gets back with the marshal." Red looked at her. "And you?" "I'll be here. Alone. I have the documents and I have the pistol," she said. "And Haynes doesn't know what I have and what I've already sent. As long as he doesn't know that, I have more protection than I would if I left this house and let him walk in unopposed." Red Dawson had opinions about this. She could see them crossing his face. He was a practical man, and practical men sometimes had difficulty with the reality that the most practical option in a given situation was not always the safest one. He held his opinions for a moment, then set them down. "I'll be back by noon," he said. "Send word if anything changes," she said. He left. She heard his horse in the yard and then on the road, and then the quiet settled in around her, the particular quiet of a damaged house, with the smell of burned wood riding the air and the cold coming through the gap where the kitchen had been. She spent the morning in focused work, not because the work was calming, it wasn't, but because it was necessary, and because the alternative was sitting with her hands in her lap, thinking about what Haynes might be doing in town, which helped nothing. She reorganized the document package in order of legal weight, starting with the federal deed registration and marriage certificate, followed by the assay report, followed by the manipulated loan comparisons, followed by the front company option agreement with Edmund's notation, followed by the Compton letter, followed by her own notes, which were clear and detailed and dated and would serve as summary testimony. She made a second copy of her notes by hand, not complete but sufficient, and put the copy in the satchel and the originals in the document case so that if one was taken, the other existed. She also found, in the course of reorganizing, two things she'd missed in the original nights of reading. The first was a receipt for a telegraph sent by Edmund Blackwell to the territorial governor's office, dated 14 months ago, 3 months before the surveyor had appeared on the East Road. The telegraph's content wasn't recorded. Edmund would have had to go to town to send it, but its existence meant Edmund had tried to involve higher authority at some point. The second was a folded note tucked inside the back cover of the oldest account ledger, written in Edmund's handwriting but clearly old, the paper brown at the edges. It said, "If anything happens before Rowan is ready, the East Hills alone are worth the fight. Don't let them bury it with me." Martha sat with that note for a long time. She thought about Edmund Blackwell, managing this for years alone, protecting something he believed in for a son who didn't know it needed protecting. She thought about the particular loneliness of that. She thought about how heavy it must have gotten toward the end, when the debt was crushing and the ranch was failing and the man who was taking everything from him was the same man administering the legal machinery that was supposed to protect him. She folded the note and put it in the document case with everything else. Then she heard the horses. Not one this time, and not the tentative approach of Cutter on official business. This was several horses moving fast on the East Road, and the sound carried the quality of purpose rather than caution. She was at the window before the thought fully formed, and what she saw in the yard resolved itself quickly from confusion into something clear and cold. 6 riders, Haynes at the front, Cutter beside him, and 4 men she didn't recognize whose posture said hired rather than official, and no commission seal on anyone's coat this time. He'd dropped the pretense completely. She checked her pistol. 6 rounds, all present. She put it in her coat pocket with her hand around it and went to the front door, and she stood in the doorway, and she did not feel calm exactly, but she felt focused, which was the thing that mattered. Haynes pulled up in the yard and looked at the burned section at the back of the house, and then looked at Martha with an expression that was not quite what she'd expected. She'd expected satisfaction, or the performance of regret, or the businesslike face of a man completing a transaction. What she saw instead was something harder and less comfortable. The face of a man who had miscalculated something and was compensating. That told her something. He'd expected the fire to be worse. He'd expected the documents to be ash. "Mr. Haynes," she said. Her voice was level. She was proud of that. He dismounted. The others stayed on their horses, which she noted. "Mrs. Blackwell." The courtesy was back, thinner than before. "I understand there was a fire last night. I've come to—" "You've come because the fire didn't accomplish what you needed it to," she said, and she said it without heat, as a statement of observed fact, because sometimes the most powerful thing you could do was simply name what was happening and let the naming do its work. "You sent 2 men to burn the kitchen wall and you expected the documents to be in the kitchen. They weren't." The yard went very still. Cutter, beside Haynes, shifted in his saddle. One of the 4 hired men looked at Haynes's back, a quick look, the look of someone recalculating their own situation. Haynes's jaw tightened. "That's a serious accusation." "I have 2 faces memorized," Martha said. "One was riding a gray horse with a white blaze. The other was older, sitting his horse like a wagon driver." She looked at the 4 hired men behind Haynes, one by one. "Neither of them is here today, which tells me you changed your crew this morning, which tells me you know exactly who was at that fence last night." She kept her eyes on Haynes. "I have a complete description ready for the federal marshal, who, for your information, received my detailed letter 2 days ago and has been in contact with Rowan since last night." Something moved across Haynes's face that she had not seen there before. Not fear exactly. The man was not going to show her fear if he could help it, but a recalculation, a rapid reassessment of the landscape he was standing in. "You have been very busy," he said, and his voice had gone quiet in a way that was not quietness, but the compression of something larger. "I'm an efficient person," she said. "It's a quality that's easy to underestimate." He looked at the document case, which she had not brought to the door with her. It was on the study desk, which was not visible from the doorway. His eyes came back to her. "Whatever you think you have, I have the assay report dated 8 years ago," she said. "I have 3 loan agreements with the original commission receipts showing the rate discrepancies. I have an incomplete option agreement for subsurface rights on the eastern section, with your front company named as buyer and my father-in-law's notation on the back. I have a letter from the lawyer who drafted the will indicating he was uncomfortable with certain provisions. I have evidence that the commission petition claiming coercion was filed before my husband even arrived in Caldwell, which means it was prepared in advance, which is a form of filing fraud." She looked at him steadily. "I could go on," Cutter said very quietly to Haynes's side. "Victor." Haynes didn't look at him. "What do you want?" he said to Martha. And the fact that he'd said it, that he'd moved from assertion to question, was itself something. She felt it in the air, the shift of it. "I want you to leave this property," she said, "and I want you to be here tomorrow at noon to answer questions from the federal marshal who will be arriving with my husband." She paused. "And I want every family in this valley who's been paying manipulated loan rates through your commission office to have those overpayments restored. I have enough in this document case to compel all 3. I'd prefer to compel them legally and with minimum theater, because theater is time-consuming, and I have a ranch to rebuild. But I'll do it whichever way becomes necessary." The hired man with the quick eyes had put his horse into a slow, casual, sideways movement that was taking him to the edge of the yard without quite looking like leaving. Martha noticed it. Haynes noticed that she noticed. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Haynes said with a precision that was the last resort of a man who has run out of improvisation, "You are standing in a burned house with no witnesses and a document case that won't matter if it's not intact." He said it to the man on his left, the one who was built like an anvil and had not said a single word since they arrived. The man started to dismount. Martha drew the pistol. She didn't point it at the big man. She pointed it at Haynes because Haynes was the decision and the rest of them were the execution of the decision. And if you stop the decision, you stop the rest. "Don't," she said. The big man stopped with one foot on the ground and one still in the stirrup, frozen in the awkward posture of someone interrupted mid-movement. Haynes looked at the pistol. His face went through something complicated. "A woman pointing a gun in her own doorway," he said, "at the Territorial Land Commissioner. A woman protecting her legal property from a man who has committed fraud, manipulation of official records, and arson," she said. "The marshal's office will sort out which narrative holds up." A sound came from the east road. Hoofbeats. Multiple horses, coming fast, and from the west simultaneously, which was wrong in a way that took her a moment to parse, and then she understood. 2 groups, from 2 directions, and neither of them was Haynes's people, because Haynes was already looking over his shoulder with an expression that was no longer calculating anything, but had passed into something raw. The riders from the west came into the yard first, and Martha recognized Hayes Garrett at the front with 2 of his men behind him. And Garrett's face was the face of a man who had heard something this morning that had brought him here at a gallop. He pulled up at the yard gate and looked at the scene. Haynes and Cutter and the hired men, Martha in the doorway with the pistol, the burned back of the house, and absorbed it with the speed of a man accustomed to reading situations that didn't explain themselves. "Martha," he said. "Hayes," she said. "Thank you for coming." The riders from the east came around the corner of the yard fence a few seconds later, and Martha let herself feel the thing she'd been holding back for 2 days, the thing that was not quite relief but was adjacent to it and warm in a similar way, when she saw Rowan at the front on his road-dusty horse, and behind him 2 men in the long dark coats that said Federal Marshal before any badge needed to be shown. Rowan pulled up and took in the yard the same way Garrett had, fast, complete, the pistol, Haynes, the hired men, the burned wall. And something crossed his face that was too many things at once to name separately. He looked at Martha. "You all right?" he said. Yes, she said. And this time it was true. The taller of the two marshals rode forward. There was a gray-haired man with the unhurried manner of someone who had done this kind of work for a long time and no longer needed to make it look impressive. He looked at Haynes. "Victor Haynes?" he said. Haynes turned. Something in his posture changed. Not collapse, not yet, but a settling, the way a building settles before it falls. "Yes." "Marshal Daniel Cord, Federal Marshal, Wichita District. I have a federal warrant for examination of the Territorial Land Commission records and related accounts. And I have an affidavit from the Federal Land Office in Caldwell regarding a fraudulent petition filed in connection with the Blackwell Estate registration." He reached into his coat and produced the warrant, which he held up without offering it. "I also have a telegram from a notary in Caldwell named Agnes Farrow, who certifies documents she received 3 days ago describing loan manipulation in the Commission's records across multiple accounts." He looked at Haynes for a moment. "I've had a productive night," Cutter said quietly to Haynes. "Victor, I'm not—" He stopped, tried again. "I have a family." Haynes turned to look at Cutter, and the look on his face was the look of a man who has just understood that the structure around him has stopped holding, and that understanding was arriving piece by piece in the wrong order. The big man who'd had one foot on the ground quietly put it back in the stirrup and made his horse take 3 careful steps backward toward the gate. "Mr. Haynes," Marshal Cord said, "I need you and your men to remain in the yard while I review the situation here." He looked at Martha. "Mrs. Blackwell, your husband tells me you have a documentation." "I do," she said. She lowered the pistol, though she did not put it away. "Come inside. I'll show you." She stepped back from the door to let the marshal through, and as she did, she looked at Rowan, who had dismounted and was standing just inside the yard gate, and his face was doing the thing it did when it was feeling something that it hadn't settled on a name for yet. He looked exhausted. 2 days of hard riding showed in every line of him, but his eyes were clear and steady. "The kitchen's gone," she said. "I can see that," he said. "I kept what mattered." "I know you did," he said, and the plainness of it, the absence of surprise in it, was something she registered in a place she didn't examine immediately. She went inside with the marshal, and Rowan followed, and the second marshal remained in the yard with Garrett and his men, providing the kind of company that kept Haynes and his people exactly where they were standing. The study was as she'd left it, document case on the desk, lamp still burning from the night, the faint smell of smoke from the ruined back of the house drifting through but not overwhelming. She put the pistol on the desk beside the document case and opened the case and began to lay out the documents in the order she'd organized them, explaining each one as she placed it, clearly and without drama. Marshal Cord listened. He was a man who listened the way experienced people listen, completely, without visible reaction, asking precise questions at precise moments. When she set down the assay report, he picked it up and read it fully before setting it back. When she showed him the front company option agreement with Edmund's notation, he looked at it for a long time. Rowan stood by the window and listened to her present everything, and the expression on his face settled gradually from exhausted alertness into something quieter. Not relief. It wasn't over yet, and all of them knew it, but a kind of arrival, the recognition of solid ground after days of uncertain footing. "The 2 men at the fence last night," the marshal said. "Can you give me those descriptions now?" She gave them. He wrote them down with the economical precision of a man who wrote a great deal and had made his handwriting useful rather than decorative. "The front company," he said. "Have you been able to identify who else might be named in that structure beyond Haynes?" "I haven't had the resources to investigate it fully," she said. "The document itself only names the company. Edmund's notation identifies it as Haynes's, but that's Edmund's word, written privately, not a formal record. You'll need the company registration documents, which would be filed in the territorial capital." "We'll get them," he said, with the flatness of someone stating a procedural certainty rather than making a promise. He closed his notebook. "Mrs. Blackwell, this is a substantial package. It would have taken most investigators considerably longer to assemble." "I had 3 days," she said, "and I know how to read." He looked at her with the slight adjustment of attention that she'd seen in a handful of people over the course of her life, the look of someone updating a prior estimate. "Yes," he said. "So I understand." He went back out to the yard, and Martha stood in the study and exhaled for the first time in what felt like hours. The documents were still spread across the desk. The lamp was burning. The smell of smoke was in everything. Rowan came away from the window and stood near the desk, looking at the organized spread of papers. "How long did you sleep?" he said. "Some," she said. "How much is some?" She considered being imprecise about this and decided it wasn't worth it. "A few hours, over 3 days." He looked at her. His jaw did the thing where it tightened without him seeming to notice it was doing it. "You could have left," he said, "gone to town, stayed at Clara's, and let Haynes walk into an undefended house. The documents could have gone with you." "Yes," she said, and then he would have filed papers claiming the property was abandoned by both owners and moved for immediate commission administration, which he was going to do the moment the house was empty. She looked at Rowan. "I know you understand that. You're saying it anyway because you're worried, which is a reasonable thing to be, but it doesn't change the calculation." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You had the gun on him when I rode in." "Yes." "You would have used it." She thought about the moment, Haynes's eyes going to the document case, the big man's foot coming down from the stirrup, the particular decision that had been about to happen in that yard. "If I'd needed to," she said, "would you have been all right with that?" He said it carefully, not challenging, genuinely asking. She thought about it honestly. "No," she said, "but I would have done it anyway. There's a difference." Something in his face shifted, and he nodded once, the nod of a man who respects an honest answer even when it's not a comfortable one. From the yard came the sound of voices. The marshals, even and authoritative, and Cutter's, which had taken on the quality of a man who has decided that cooperation is now the most useful posture available to him. And Haynes's voice, which was saying something in the controlled tone of a man managing a situation that has moved beyond his control and managing it badly. Rowan went to the window. Martha came to stand beside him, and they looked out at the yard together, where Marshal Cord was speaking to Haynes with the warrant visible in his hand, and Haynes's 4 hired men had arranged themselves in the unconscious posture of people who wish they were somewhere else. Garrett and his 2 men were at the gate, not interfering, simply present, which was its own kind of statement. "Cord wants to take him to Wichita today," Rowan said. "He told me on the road. He's been building a separate case against the commission office for about a year. Something about a land fraud in the Northern Territory. Our documentation fills gaps he didn't have." "Then we weren't the only ones," Martha said. "No," Rowan said. "Apparently not." He paused. "Edmund might have been one of several." She thought about a telegraph to the governor's office. She thought about a man managing a secret for 8 years, trying different approaches, writing telegraphs that went unanswered, refusing to sign a document that would have taken the most valuable thing he owned, fighting in the only ways available to him, which were insufficient until there was no more time. "He tried," she said. "He did," Rowan said, and his voice was rough at the edges again, in the same way it had been when she'd first told him about the assay report. He looked at the window a moment longer, then turned away from it. "The house," he said. "The kitchen section is gone. The front rooms and the study are structurally sound," she said. "The brick backing held. You'll need a builder to assess the back wall before the spring thaw, but the foundation is intact." He looked at the study around him. His father's books, his father's desk, the lamp that was still burning, the spread of documents that had saved everything. "We'll rebuild," he said. "Better than it was." "Yes," she said. "We will." Outside, something changed in the quality of the voices. Martha went back to the window and saw that Cord had stepped closer to Haynes, and Haynes's posture had undergone a final visible change, the last compression before a structure gives. Cutter had dismounted and was talking to the second marshal with the rapid, slightly too eager manner of a man repositioning himself as helpful. The 4 hired men were being told something by Cord's partner, and 2 of them were nodding in the way that people nod when they're calculating the minimum cooperation required to avoid the maximum consequence. And then Haynes turned, and for a moment he looked directly at the study window, and Martha was standing close enough to the glass that she could see his face clearly, and he could see hers. He had not won. She could see him understanding that, the particular look of a man who has held something in his hands for 4 years and has opened his hands to find it gone. He had built something careful and cruel over a long time, and she had taken it apart in 3 days, and she could see him measuring that gap, and not knowing what to do with it. She did not feel triumphant. She felt tired and cold, and aware of the smell of smoke in her coat and the fact that she had slept perhaps 8 hours in the last 72, and aware that there was a very great deal of work ahead before any of this translated into something that looked like the life she was going to need to build here. She felt the distance between winning a confrontation and having a home, and it was longer than it looked. But she met Victor Haynes's eyes through the window, and she did not look away. And after a moment he did. Marshal Cord said something to him, and he turned, and the marshals moved to flank him with the practiced geometry of men who have done this before. And that was more or less the end of Victor Haynes as the Territorial Land Commissioner. Rowan came to stand beside her again at the window. His shoulder was near her shoulder without quite touching it, and she was aware of that in the particular way you are aware of things when you are exhausted and your defenses have been occupied elsewhere. Cord says it'll take weeks to fully unwind the commission records, he said, possibly months before it all shakes out legally. Haynes has lawyers. He'll fight it. Of course he will, she said. We have the documents. He can fight all he wants. Rowan was quiet for a moment. Garrett brought something. He didn't want to hand it to you with everything happening, but he reached into his coat and produced a folded envelope. It arrived at the copper rail 2 days ago, addressed to you, from the assayer in Wichita. She took it, she opened it, and read it, and held it for a moment. The preliminary analysis, she said. They looked at the rock samples I described in my letter and the assay report I summarized for them. She turned the letter over in her hands. They want to send a formal team. They say the formation description is consistent with significant silver deposits. How significant? Rowan said. She found the relevant line and read it to him. He was very quiet after that. Outside, the sound of horses in the yard was thinning as Haynes and his men were moved out, and the voices of Cord and his partner and Garrett carried in through the cold window glass, and somewhere in the distance a bird called once and stopped. Martha, Rowan said, and his voice had that roughness in it again. I know, she said. No. He stopped, started again. I mean, I know you know about the silver. I'm not talking about the silver. He was looking at the window, not at her, which she thought was probably easier for him. When I came over that ridge and saw the burned wall and you standing in the doorway with the gun, he paused. I've been running that image since I saw it. You, standing there, not anywhere else, not with the document somewhere safe and yourself in town, right there. That's where I needed to be, she'd said. I know that, he said. I know that. He finally looked at her. I'm not arguing with the decision. I'm telling you what I felt when I saw it, because I think you're a person who deserves to know when she's affected someone, even if knowing it is inconvenient. She looked at him. His face was honest in the particular way of faces when the person wearing them has run out of energy for anything else. And she thought about the document on the study desk that had her name and his name on it, signed in front of Red Dawson in a saloon at 11:40-something on New Year's Eve, and about how much had happened in the days since, and about how strange it was to have gone through all of it with someone she'd known for less than a week. You need to sleep, she said. You've been writing for 2 days. Is that all you're going to say? She was quiet for a moment. No, she said. But the rest can wait until we're both human again. She looked at the window, at the yard where Garrett was talking to the second marshal, and Cutter was being put on a horse with his hands where the marshal could see them. There's a great deal still to do. There is, he agreed. The commission records will need an independent review. We'll need a solicitor for the estate claims, the builder for the kitchen, the formal assay team, hiring ranch hands. She paused. Rebuilding the accounts from scratch once the fraudulent interest is removed. That's a long list, he said. It's a starting list, she said. There's more. He almost smiled. It was a tired smile, worn at the edges, but it was there. All right, he said. You win. We sleep first. We sleep first, she agreed. Outside, Marshal Cord was mounting up, and Haynes was on a horse with a lead rope attached to it, and the ordinary cold morning light was falling across the burned back of the house, and the intact front of it, and the eastern hills beyond the pasture, sitting quiet and enormous in the January sky, keeping what they kept. Martha looked at those hills and thought about Edmund Blackwell's note on brown paper. The East Hills alone are worth the fight. He'd been right. He'd just needed someone to be ready to fight it before the time ran out. She turned away from the window. There was work to do and rest to take before the work, and a future to build out of documents and testimony and silver deposits, and a marriage that had started as arithmetic and had become, in the space of 4 days and a fire and a man with a gun in her yard, something she didn't have a clean name for yet. She went to put more wood on the parlor stove. They slept. Not together, not in any way that required explanation or navigation. Rowan took his father's room and Martha took the spare room that Clara Whitmore had vacated, and they slept the way people sleep when their bodies have simply stopped accepting instructions from their minds, deeply and without dreaming, through the rest of that morning and into the afternoon. When Martha woke, the light through the window was the flat gold of late January at 3 o'clock, and for a moment she lay still and listened to the house and heard nothing alarming, and that absence of alarm was itself something she needed a moment to adjust to. She dressed and went to the kitchen out of habit before she remembered. There was no kitchen, and stood in the hall looking at the gap where the back of the house had been. The cold came through it freely now, and the smell of char had settled into everything, and the edge of the burned section showed the interior brick wall standing clean and dark against the winter sky where the exterior boards had gone. It looked like something between a wound and a door, an opening that hadn't existed before and would need to be closed before the spring rains came. She went to the parlor instead and built up the small stove and put water on for coffee and stood looking out the window at the eastern hills while she waited for it to boil. The hills looked the same as they always had. Patient, enormous, indifferent to everything that had happened around them over the past week. She thought about the 3 silver deposits sitting inside them, undisturbed for 1,000 years before an 8-year-old assay report found them, and a land commissioner tried to steal them, and a woman working in a saloon kitchen read a will in 45 seconds and changed the direction of everything. The hills didn't know about any of that. They just sat there in the January light, which she found, strangely, comforting. Rowan appeared in the parlor doorway while she was pouring the coffee. His hair was not in order, and his face had the particular softness of someone recently returned from genuine sleep, and he looked younger than she'd seen him look since the night they met, which had been 4 days ago and felt like considerably longer. "How long did I sleep?" he said. "About 7 hours," she said. "Coffee." He took it and sat down in the chair by the stove, and she sat across from him, and for a while they were quiet in the way that had become, over 4 days of crisis, their natural register. Not silence from having nothing to say, but silence from being comfortable enough not to fill the air unnecessarily. "Cord sent word," Rowan said eventually, "before I went to sleep. He's holding Haynes in Wichita pending a federal grand jury. Cutter is cooperating. He told Cord this morning that the front company has been operating for 6 years, and there are at least 8 other properties in the territory where similar loan manipulation was carried out." He turned his cup. "Edmund wasn't the only one. Not by far." "I know," Martha said. "I suspected it. The commission records are being audited. It'll take months. There's going to be a federal examiner based out of the Capitol reviewing every loan that passed through the commission office in the past decade." He looked up at her. "Cord says our documentation was the thing that made it actionable. He had suspicions for a year. He needed the paper trail." "Edmund kept everything," she said. "That's what made it possible. He kept every receipt, every letter, every document. He was building a case the only way he knew how, just too slowly." She was quiet for a moment. He needed someone who could read what he'd saved and understand what it meant. Rowan looked at her across the stove. "Yeah," he said. He did. The days that followed were not easy, and Martha would not have called them easy even in retrospect, because easy was not the right word for what rebuilding something from partial ruin actually felt like from the inside. What they were was necessary and progress, and sometimes deeply frustrating, and occasionally clarifying in ways that unexpected difficulties tend to be. The solicitor Agnes Farrow recommended arrived from Caldwell at the end of the first week, a compact, precise woman named Ruth Halsey, who wore her hair pinned in a way that said, "I have better things to think about than my hair," which Martha respected immediately. Ruth Halsey reviewed the document package in a single sitting and then looked up and said, "Whoever organized this saved themselves approximately $3,000 in reconstruction fees. These are in better order than most things I see from trained investigators." "She organized it," Rowan said. Ruth Halsey looked at Martha with the measuring attention of a professional seeing another professional. "Good," she said. "I'll need your notes in the case filing. Your summaries are clearer than the primary documents. The legal process was exactly as slow as Rowan had predicted, and exactly as unrelenting as Martha had expected, and they moved through it the way you move through something that has to be moved through. One document at a time, one filing at a time, one letter answered, and one response drafted, with Ruth Halsey navigating the federal machinery and Martha reviewing everything that passed through the House, and Rowan making the physical trips that needed to be made in person. The assay team arrived from Wichita in the second week of February, 4 men with equipment that required 2 additional mules to transport, who spent a week on the eastern hills and said very little to anyone until they were done, at which point their lead man, a dry, careful person named Henderson, came to the parlor and spread his findings on the table and said, "The informal estimate in your prior report was conservative." Martha and Rowan sat across from him and looked at the numbers, and neither of them said anything for a moment. "Conservative," Rowan repeated. "The 3 formations are connected at depth," Henderson said. "That changes the yield estimate substantially. The northern formation alone is larger than we initially projected from surface indicators." He looked at the numbers himself with the detached professional interest of a man who deals in large figures regularly enough that they don't affect him personally. "You'll want to file formal mineral claims immediately. I'd recommend a surveyor's certification before that, so the claim boundaries are clean. There may be other parties who become interested once word gets around." "Word won't get around until the claims are filed," Martha said. "Can your team certify the boundaries today before you leave?" Henderson looked at her. "That's not standard procedure." "I'm aware of that," she said. "I'm asking whether it's possible." He considered it. "It would require an additional fee." "Name it." He named it, and Martha didn't blink at the number, which was considerable, and Henderson appeared to recalibrate his impression of the woman sitting across from him with the coffee cup and the direct eyes and the house that smelled faintly of smoke. "We can have the certification done by tonight," he said. "Good," she said. "Thank you." After Henderson left, Rowan looked at her across the table. "We don't have that fee in cash right now," he said. "Not until the fraudulent interest is returned by the commission audit, which Red Dawson will lend it to us," she said. "I'll ride to town this afternoon." "You're sure he'll—" "I bought 2 years of supplies on credit at the Copper Rail when I first came to Ash Hollow," she said. "He never charged me interest, and he never asked when I'd pay it back. Yes, I'm sure." She was right. Red Dawson handed over the fee from the Copper Rail's cash box without hesitation, and when she tried to give him a promissory note, he waved it aside. "Write me something when it's convenient," he said. "And Martha, whatever you did with that saloon kitchen over 4 years, I should have been paying you twice what I was." "Yes," she said. "You should have." She said it without rancor, just as a fact, and he accepted it the same way. The formal mineral claims were filed at the Federal Land Office in Caldwell on the 14th of February, certified and boundary surveyed and registered under the names Martha Elaine Blackwell and Rowan Edmund Blackwell, co-equal owners. The clerk who processed the filing looked at the survey numbers and then looked up at them and then looked at the numbers again. "These are," he started. "Correct," Martha said. "Yes." The clerk filed them without further comment, with the slightly dazed expression of a man doing paperwork for something he will tell his grandchildren about. The kitchen was rebuilt starting in March, when the worst of the cold lifted enough for the carpenter from Ash Hollow, a quiet man named Peters, who worked with his son and didn't talk unnecessarily, to assess the foundation and declare it sound. It took 3 weeks. The new kitchen was larger than the old one because Martha had looked at the burned section and seen that the original had been cramped in a way that served no purpose, and she'd said so to Rowan, and Rowan had said, "Build it the way you want it," and so she had. It had a proper workspace and 2 windows and a pantry with actual shelving, and when it was done and the smell of new wood replaced the smell of char, something in the house felt different, more inhabited, more like a place that intended to stand for another 50 years rather than simply endure the winter. The ranch hands came back in April. Not the same ones who had left in October. 2 of them had found other work and stayed, but Rowan put out the word through Garrett, and 3 men came. A young one named Cooper, who was earnest to the point of occasional uselessness, but worked hard enough to compensate. An older hand named Sam Briggs, who had worked Blackstone Range 15 years ago and left when Edmund's financial trouble became visible. And a woman named Dorothea Price, who had been running a neighbor's horses for 2 seasons. and who arrived with her own saddle and a calm competence that Martha recognized and trusted within the first morning. The bunkhouse needed work, which Peters and his son came back to do in May. The south fence was repaired in segments through April and May, with Garrett's men helping on the weekends in the way that neighbors help when they are genuinely invested in the outcome. The North Creek was properly mapped for the first time, which revealed that its course had shifted slightly in the past decade and was now running closer to the eastern hill formation than the old surveys showed, which Henderson said was consistent with what they'd found below ground. Victor Haynes's trial began in Wichita in June. Martha went with Rowan and Ruth Halsey, all three of them on the train, which had reached Caldwell the previous year and made the journey something that didn't require 3 days on horseback. She testified for 2 hours. She was precise and organized and answered every question directly, and the opposing lawyer tried twice to rattle her and failed both times. And the jury foreman wrote something down when she explained the loan manipulation in plain terms that left no room for ambiguity. Haynes was convicted on 11 counts, including fraud, manipulation of official records, and conspiracy to commit arson, which the two riders at the fence line had eventually been identified and charged with, one of them trading information about Haynes's instructions for a reduced sentence. Cutter received a reduced sentence for his cooperation, which Ruth Halsey said was the correct outcome even if it wasn't the satisfying one, and Martha agreed because satisfying and correct were not always the same thing, and she'd known that for a long time. The families who had paid manipulated loan rates through the commission office received formal notices of restitution beginning in late summer. The audit had identified 14 affected accounts, ranging from small amounts to, in the case of the Blackwell estate, a figure that made Ruth Halsey raise her eyebrows when the final calculation came through. Martha read the restitution figure at the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning in August with her coffee going cold beside her. Rowan came in from the barn and looked at her face and said, "What's the number?" She told him. He sat down. "That's," he started. "Yes," she said, combined with the first silver draw. "We're out of debt," she said, "completely," and passed it. She turned the paper over on the table and looked at the window, at the eastern hills showing green now with the summer growth, the exposed rock face on the south slope barely visible from this distance, but there, always there. "Your father would have—" She stopped. "Yeah," Rowan said. His voice had the rough edge it always got when Edmund came into the conversation, and she'd stopped trying to smooth past it because it was his grief, and it didn't need smoothing. They sat for a while with that. "What do you want to do with it?" he said eventually. "With the restitution, the first draw. We'll have decisions to make. I want to hire 2 more hands and fix the east pasture fence properly, not patch it. I want to put a deposit on a second bunkhouse before winter. I want to pay Red Dawson back with interest, regardless of what he says about not needing it." She turned the paper back over and looked at the number again. "And I want to establish a small fund, not large but reliable, for families in the valley who are dealing with commission disputes from the audit. Some of those people are in worse shape than we were, and they don't have an assay report." Rowan looked at her. "That's—" "Yes," he said. "All of it. Yes." He said it without hesitation, which was a thing she noticed about him that she had not stopped noticing over the months. The absence of hesitation when something was right. He could be slow to speak and slow to decide, but when he'd decided, the decision was complete. It was a quality she'd come to rely on in the way you rely on a fence post that's been set properly. The town of Ash Hollow changed around them over those months, in the way that small towns change when something central to their understanding of themselves has shifted. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't everyone arriving at the ranch with apologies and explanations, because most people weren't built for that kind of accounting, and Martha didn't require it of them. It was smaller than that, and more real. Clara Whitmore stopped in at the ranch every few weeks, ostensibly to visit, but mostly because she'd found, in the aftermath of everything, that she liked Martha's company and wasn't embarrassed to say so. Hayes Garrett brought his wife to dinner in May, and his wife turned out to be a woman of formidable practical intelligence who had strong opinions about water rights law, and made Martha laugh for the first time in what felt like a long time. Old Pete Halverson renewed his grazing contract in March with a handshake rather than just a paper, which was Pete's way of saying something he was constitutionally unable to put into words. Cleet Osgood avoided the ranch entirely, which suited everyone. Red Dawson accepted repayment of the loan in July, with interest, and grumbled about the interest in the way of a man who is moved by a gesture he's pretending to find annoying. The Reverend Miles, who had married them in 1158 on a night that felt like it had happened in a different life, stopped Martha in the street one day in June and said simply, "I was glad to do it that night. I want you to know that." She looked at him. He was a small, rumpled man with kind eyes, and the permanent faint smell of the bourbon he drank rather more of than was advisable. "Thank you, Reverend," she said, and meant it. What didn't change was Martha herself, and this was the thing that the town had to sit with in its own time and its own way. She didn't lose weight. She didn't become smaller or quieter or more decorative. She didn't dress differently or carry herself differently or apologize for the space she occupied, physically or otherwise. She was the same woman who had walked through the kitchen door of the Copper Rail on New Year's Eve and asked a single question that stopped a room, and she remained that woman, and the town had to decide, one person at a time, what to do with that. Most of them decided, eventually, to simply deal with it, to treat her as what she was, which was half owner of the largest producing ranch in the territory, and the woman who had dismantled Victor Haynes's fraud with 3 days of reading by lamplight. Some of them managed more than that, managed something closer to genuine respect, which is different from accommodation, and Martha could tell the difference, and kept track. Dorothea Price, the new hand, came to Martha 3 months into the job and said she had questions about the account books, and Martha spent 2 evenings showing her how the system worked, and watched Dorothea catch on with a speed that reminded her of herself at a younger age, and felt something that was not quite pride, but was in the same neighborhood. Cooper, the earnest young hand, got better. Gradually, imperfectly, and with several notable errors that cost them 2 fence posts and 1 afternoon of rounding up cattle from a neighbor's pasture. But he got better, and by autumn he had graduated from earnest and useless to earnest and occasionally useful, which was progress. Sam Briggs turned out to have opinions about the eastern hills that were worth hearing. He'd worked near Silver Country before, years ago, and knew what to expect from the practical side of a mining operation running alongside a ranching operation, which Henderson's team had confirmed was possible without one destroying the other. He and Martha had several conversations about logistics that Rowan sat in on without much contribution, not because he had nothing to offer, but because he knew enough to know when other people were saying the things that needed to be said. The second silver draw came in September, and the figure was larger than the first. On the evening of the day they received that news, Rowan and Martha sat on the porch of the rebuilt house. It had a proper porch now, with a railing, something the original house had lacked, and watched the light go out of the sky over the western ridge and stages. The air was cooling, and the first hint of autumn was in it. That particular edge that frontier country got in late September when the summer wasn't quite gone, but had started making arrangements to leave. They had been sitting there for a while, not talking much, and the quiet was the easy kind, the kind they'd built up over 8 months of building everything else. "I want to ask you something," Rowan said. "All right," Martha said. He turned to look at her, and his face in the last of the evening light was the face of a man who has thought about a thing carefully and arrived somewhere and is uncertain whether arriving there is appropriate, but has decided to say it anyway. He reached into his coat pocket and took out something small and held it out on his palm. It was a ring, not an elaborate one, a plain band of silver, clearly hand-worked, with a small irregular knot shape at its center that she recognized, after a moment, as the same silver that had come out of the first draw from the eastern hills. Someone had made it here, from what this land produced. She looked at it for a long moment. "We're already married," she said. "I know that," he said. "We got married 11 minutes before midnight in front of a half-drunk reverend and 20 people from a saloon who mostly came to see if it was real." He kept his palm extended, the ring sitting on it. "I'm asking you something different now. I'm asking if you'd want to stay. Not because of the papers, not because of the property, because this is where you belong. Because in 8 months of working beside you, I have not once thought a situation was unmanageable, which I am not able to say for any previous period of my adult life." He stopped. "That came out more like a business recommendation than I intended." Martha looked at the ring. She thought about the night she'd walked through the kitchen door of the Copper Rail and looked at a desperate man with an envelope and made a calculation that turned out to be about considerably more than arithmetic. She thought about 3 nights reading by lamplight and a burning wall and a pistol in her coat pocket and a document case held against her chest in a frozen yard, and the particular quality of relief she'd felt when she heard his horses on the east road and looked up and saw him at the front. She thought about what it was to be seen, not observed. She'd been observed her whole life, commented on, categorized, but seen, the thing you actually were without the editing. That did come out like a business recommendation, she said. I know, I'm sorry. I'm not finished, she said. He stopped. I came to Ash Hollow 4 years ago with a leaking roof and unpaid taxes and a job that paid enough to keep the house from being taken. I have spent 4 years in this town being the woman they laughed at, which I made peace with because the alternative was letting it make me smaller, and I was not prepared to be smaller. She looked at the ring and then at him. In the last 8 months, I have also been the woman who reads contracts faster than their lawyers, and the woman who stayed in a burning house because the work required it, and the woman who held a pistol on a territorial commissioner in her own doorway. She paused. I did not do any of that for sentiment. I did it because this is my land and my work and my life, and I build what I build because that is who I am. She looked at his face. But you knew that. You knew that the night you agreed to my terms in the saloon, and it's part of why I said yes, because you agreed without needing to understand it first. Rowan was very still. So yes, she said, I'd want to stay. Not because of the paper, as you said, because this is where I'm building something that matters. She looked at his eyes. And because you're the one I want to build it with, since we're saying things. He looked at her for a moment, and his face did the complicated thing it did when it was feeling several things simultaneously and hadn't sorted them into order yet. Then he took her hand and put the ring on her finger, and it fit, which should not have surprised her but did slightly, and she thought someone had measured or guessed well. How did you size it? She said. Clara, he said. She asked in a way that I thought was just conversation. Martha made a note to speak to Clara Whitmore about her methods. The ring was plain and a little rough at the edges, where the metalwork showed the hand of someone still learning the craft, which she discovered later was the work of Cooper, the earnest young hand, who turned out to have a talent for metalwork that had been entirely invisible behind his fence post failures, and who had spent 3 weeks in secret on this particular project. When Martha found out, she went to the bunkhouse and told him it was good work, and he went red to the ears and said, "Thank you, Mrs. Blackwell," in the voice of someone who had been hoping they'd done something right and was relieved to have confirmation. The full legal resolution of the commission fraud case came through in November, 8 months after Haynes's arrest. The 14 affected families received final restitution statements. Haynes received a federal prison sentence. The front company was dissolved and its assets distributed to the affected parties in a formula that Ruth Halsey had negotiated with a tenacity that made the federal examiner write her a professional compliment in his closing report, which she accepted with the brevity of someone who regarded compliments as acknowledgement of what she'd already known. The Territorial Land Commission was restructured under federal oversight, and the new commissioner was a man from outside the territory with no existing interests in it, which was the only kind of person who should have been commissioner in the first place. Ash Hollow got a little quieter without Victor Haynes in it. The kind of quiet that towns get when a thing that has been humming with low-level menace for years has stopped. Some people hadn't even known they'd been tense until the tension was gone, and the recognition of that was its own uncomfortable education. On a Tuesday in November in the kitchen, she had designed herself with the 2 windows and the proper shelving. Martha was working through the quarterly accounts, the ranch accounts, and the separate ledger she'd started for the Eastern Hill operation, which required its own bookkeeping, when she stopped and looked out the window at the yard, where Rowan was talking to Sam Briggs about the spring fence plan, and Dorothea was working with the young horses in the south paddock, and Cooper was carrying lumber from the new bunkhouse extension he'd been helping Peters build, and the eastern hills rose behind all of it in the November light, going russet and brown with the season. She thought about Edmund Blackwell writing "not yet," not until R is settled on the bottom of an assay report, and putting it in his desk and waiting and running out of time while he waited. She thought about a woman who had carried something for years without anyone knowing she was carrying it, because the carrying was private and the putting down was earned and nobody hands you either one. She thought about a saloon on New Year's Eve and a desperate man and a question that she'd asked because it was the right question, not because she'd known what came after it. She hadn't known what came after it. She had simply known that the question was the place to start. She turned back to the accounts and found her place and continued. There would always be more to do. That was not a complaint. That was the nature of something living. It required attention, continuously, because living things didn't stay still. The accounts needed tending, and the fences needed mending, and the books needed reading, and the land needed understanding, and the people who worked this ground needed to be seen clearly and treated fairly, and none of that was finished, any of it, and probably wouldn't be. That was the work. Not the crisis, not the confrontation, not the 11 minutes before midnight with the ring on a saloon bar. The work was everything after. The ordinary, necessary, ongoing work of building something that could stand. Martha Blackwell. She had taken the name without ceremony, the way she did most things, because it was hers now, and there was no use performing a relationship with something that already belonged to you. Understood this better than most. She had never expected ease. She had never expected acceptance to be handed to her in a form that required nothing from her. She had learned, early and without much gentleness, that the world looked at a woman like her and saw a category before it saw a person, and that the distance between the category and the person was a distance you had to travel yourself, on your own time, with your own resources. What she had not expected, what had surprised her, genuinely, in the way that genuine surprises are always slightly disorienting, was how much easier the traveling was when someone walked beside you who wasn't trying to slow you down. Outside, Rowan looked up from his conversation with Sam Briggs and looked toward the kitchen window, not for any particular reason that she could identify. He couldn't see her from that angle. The light was wrong. But he looked anyway. And then he turned back to Briggs, and the conversation about the fence continued, and the day continued, and the eastern hills sat in the November light and kept what they kept. Martha looked at the ring on her left hand, plain silver, rough at one edge, made from what this land produced by a young man who turned out to have unsuspected gifts. She turned it once around her finger in the absent way she'd developed over the months, the way you touch something that has become familiar, and went back to the accounts. The numbers were honest, the land was theirs, the work was good. That was enough. Not everything. There would be harder seasons, and disagreements not yet had, and problems not yet visible on any horizon. But enough. Solid enough to build on. Real enough to trust. She wrote the next figure in the ledger, clear and careful, in her own hand.